Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Bylinin_Sergey.html. The same book in other formats, http://royalib.com/book/Bylinin_Sergey/Stalingradskaya_bitva.html. Enjoy reading. Sergey Bylinin. Battle of Stalingrad. Strategic Defense. July 17 to November 18, 1942. Ideas and Plans. In the spring of 1942, after the winter counter-offensive of the Red Army, a calm settled on most of the Soviet German front. The parties were intensively preparing for summer battles. Enterprises of the Soviet military industry, transferred to the east at the end of 1941, under difficult conditions, increased the production of modernized or new types of weapons. Thus, the production of field and anti-tank artillery increased respectively by 2 and 4 times, machine guns, by 6, tanks, by 2.3 times. By May, the Red Army had 5.1 million people, 49,900 guns and mortars, 3,900 tanks, 2,200 aircraft. Taking into account the sad experience of the beginning of the war and past battles, the Soviet military leadership began to transform the organizational structure of the troops. Tank corps and air armies were formed. The defeat suffered by the German army near Moscow in December 1941 created a favorable environment for strengthening the anti-Hitler coalition of the USSR, Great Britain and the USA, but our allies were in no hurry to launch military operations in Europe and preferred to help from across the ocean. German intelligence learned that the Second Front would not be opened in 1942, and this allowed the Germans to constantly increase the number of divisions on the Eastern Front, in June from 174 to 243, and by November to 266. By the beginning of the summer of 1942, Germany had, together with their allies, 6.2 million people, 57,000 guns and mortars, 3,300 tanks and assault guns, 3,400 aircraft. Mobilizing the economy of the occupied countries, the Germans also increased the production of weapons, but lagged behind in terms of the pace and quantity of production, and in 1942 there was already an advantage in favor of the Soviet rear. The organizational structure of the German mobile troops, the main striking force of the Wehrmacht, was also improved. In the tank divisions, outdated and unsuitable for Russian conditions, light tanks PZ I and PZ-2, and on medium PZ-3 and PZ-4, long-barreled guns with a caliber of 50 and 75 mm were installed. An 88 mm anti-aircraft battalion was included in the staff of the Panzer Division, and a 4th company was added to the tank battalions. They also made changes to the states of infantry and motorized units. For example, the number of submachine gunners was increased in infantry companies. An 88 mm anti-aircraft battalion was included in the staff of the Panzer Division, and a 4th company was added to the tank battalions. They also made changes to the states of infantry and motorized units. For example, the number of submachine gunners was increased in infantry companies. An 88 mm anti-aircraft battalion was included in the staff of the Panzer Division, and a 4th company was added to the tank battalions. They also made changes to the states of infantry and motorized units. For example, the number of submachine gunners was increased in infantry companies. Superiority in manpower and means still remained on the side of the German troops. Their tank division, which had 2 regiments of motorized infantry, tank and artillery regiments and a reconnaissance battalion, consisted of 210 tanks, more than 200 guns and mortars, 50 armored vehicles and was equal in power to the Soviet tank corps. Our rifle armies usually had 4 to 5 divisions, and in the German army there were 4 corps of 3 to 4 divisions each. Of course, this cut from the First Guards. The cavalry corps could still shake the old days, even during the War of Engines, but against the background of the powerful system of German armored cars, it looks like a dull anachronism. Summer 1942. Our army was equal in composition to the German corps, inferior to it in numbers and weapons. In addition, the quality of Soviet weapons was often inferior to German, and new superior models, such as T-34 or KV tanks, were not always used skillfully. In terms of operational and tactical capabilities, the Soviet troops were still inferior to the Wehrmacht. There was a shortage of qualified personnel. When planning military operations for the summer of 1942, there was no unity of opinion in the top Soviet leadership. J.V. Stalin assumed that the Germans would be able to conduct major offensive operations in two strategic directions, most likely in Moscow and in the south, and he was very afraid for Moscow, since the enemy held more than 70 divisions here. Therefore, Stalin believed the Soviet troops, who did not yet have the strength for a major offensive, should limit themselves to strategic defense, but simultaneously carry out 5 or 6 private operations, in the Crimea, in the Igovsk, Kursk and Smolensk directions, as well as in the regions of Kharkov, Demyansk and Leningrad. The Chief of the General Staff, Marshal B. M. Shaposhnikov, sharing Stalin's opinion in principle, proposed limiting himself to only tough defense. Fearing an attack on Moscow from the west and bypassing it from the south of Oryol Tula and Kursk-Voronezh, Shaposhnikov proposed concentrating the main reserves of the headquarters in the center and partly in the Bryansk front. Army General G.K. Zhukov, agreeing with Stalin's operational forecasts and Shaposhnikov's opinion, also proposed limiting himself to defense only, but believed that one offensive frontline operation still needed to be carried out, to defeat the Rezhev-Vyazma grouping, which would force the Germans to abandon large offensives. In the south, Zhukov hoped to meet the Germans with air strikes, powerful artillery fire, wear him down with a stubborn defense, and then go on the offensive. Marshal S.K. Timoshenko believed that it was necessary to deliver a strong preemptive strike by the forces of the Southwestern, SWF, and Southern fronts, South Front, in the direction of Kharkov and further to the Dnieper line, which will upset the plans of the enemy on the entire southern wing. Stalingrad, as a rear city, was not even mentioned in all these plans. In March, a GKO meeting was held at which the complex and controversial issue of strategic planning for 1942 was once again discussed. The arguments and objections of Shaposhnikov and Zhukov were dismissed by Stalin, who stated, "We can't just sit back and wait for the Germans to strike first. We must ourselves launch a number of preemptive strikes on a broad front and test the readiness of the enemy." Zhukov proposes to launch an offensive in the western direction, and defend in the rest. I think it's a half measure. Thus, the decision was made, strategic defense with several major offensives. The duality of this decision inevitably predetermined the dispersion of forces and reserves. Soviet intelligence failed to reveal the intentions and concentration of the main enemy groupings in a timely manner. The headquarters assumed that the enemy would try to break through around Moscow from the southeast through the Bryansk front, therefore, to the detriment of the south, it strengthened the flank of the central direction, especially the Oryol Tula one. It was here that large forces were sent. In June, the Bryansk front received only in its reserve 5 tank corps, 4 tank brigades, 4 divisions, 2 cavalry corps, several artillery regiments. The first formed Soviet 5th Tank Army was also located here. Heavy armored cars SD, KFZ 232 from the reconnaissance battalion of the motorized division, Grossdeutschland, arrived in Army Group South. Summer 1942. In the German top leadership, the idea and plan for the summer campaign also became the subject of discussion. Field Marshal Rundstedt, mindful of the defeat of the Wehrmacht near Moscow, advocated the transition to strategic defense, up to the withdrawal and consolidation on the Soviet-Polish border. Chief of the General Staff F. Halder, for the resumption of the offensive against Moscow, but on condition that the Russians will be the first to show the initiative. The Chief of Operations, Husinger, strongly advocated a broad offensive. Keitel and Jodl shared Hitler's position, knowing that even after the collapse of the Blitzkrieg in 1941, he did not abandon the main goal, the crushing of the USSR as a state. And for this it was necessary not only to defeat the Soviet armies, but also to undermine their economic basis. Therefore, limited options such as fixing east of the Dnieper or holding the manganese mines near Nikopol, etc., developed under the painful impression of the Moscow defeats, were rejected. Hitler outlined the new plan and plan of the top German leadership in Directive No. 41 of April 5, 1942. The main task is to achieve a breakthrough to the Caucasus on the southern flank with the deterrent actions of the center. Therefore, all available forces must be concentrated for the operation in the southern sector in order to destroy the enemy on this side of the Don, western, right bank. Or, in order to then capture the oil regions in the Caucasus and cross the Caucasian Ridge. Stalingrad was also mentioned in the directive, but only as the final point of an auxiliary covering strike, to try to reach Stalingrad, or at least expose it to heavy weapons so that it loses its importance as a center of military industry and a communications hub. The German plan for the 1942 summer campaign of the year provided for 4 consecutive, stepwise operations. Scheme 1. 1. Breakthrough of the 2nd Field and 4th Tank Armies to Voronezh and the capture of the city. 2. The encirclement of the Russians at Korotoyak and Ostashkov near Voronezh by turning the 4th Panzer Army and at the same time breaking through the 6th Field Army to the Don. 3. The blow of the 6th Field Army from Voronezh to the south to Stalingrad and the creation of a defense line along the banks of the Don. At the same time, from the south, through the mouth of the Don, a breakthrough by the forces of the 1st Panzer Army to Stalingrad and the encirclement of the remnants of Russian troops in the interfluve of the Volga and Don. 4. After intercepting the Volga line from Stalingrad to Astrakhan, having covered ourselves with defenses from the north, turning all the available forces to the Caucasus and attacking Mozdok, Grozny, and further to Baku. Scheme 1. The German plan for the summer campaign of 1942. Exit to the Volga and impact of the Caucasus to oil sources. For the implementation of the plan, 900,000 people, 1,200 tanks, over 17,000 guns and mortars, 1,700 aircraft were allocated, that is, more than 1/3 of the forces and means. For the purposes of operational leadership, Army Group South was divided into 2 commands, Group A, 17th and 11th Field, 1st Tank Armies, Field Marshal V. List, and Group B, 4th Tank, 2nd and 6th German Field, and 2, I am the Hungarian Army, Field Marshal F. von Bock, then Wykes. The plan was based on the idea of a blitzkrieg, characteristic of the German military doctrine, only modernized to the size of one all-destroying lightning campaign. Compared with 1941, the campaign plan was limited to the scale of only the southern wing of the Eastern Front, since Germany was no longer able to conduct an offensive in all directions in 1942. According to the plan of the German strategists, the capture of the Caucasus and the most important economic regions of Ukraine, the Don, Kuban, as well as the interception of the Volga communications cut off the entire densely populated industrial south and put the Red Army and all of Russia in a hopeless situation. In addition, according to a more distant plan, the successful implementation of this plan subsequently allowed German groups to easily move north, up the Volga to Saratov, Kubyshev, Samara, and beyond, and create conditions for an attack on Moscow from the Kursk-Ural region with a simultaneous strike on it from the west. Scheme 2. Scheme 2. A copy of the map scheme captured during the Soviet counterattack on Sadovoy in September 1942. The map belonged to a representative of the General Staff of the German Army attached to the Romanian Corps. The map shows the expected dates for the withdrawal of German troops to various regions of southern Russia. Thus, the main military and political goals of the war were achieved. The main calculation was made on the use of tank and motorized groupings with strong air cover. For the operations, the flat southern Russian steppes near the Don and the Volga were deliberately chosen, as convenient as possible for the use of tanks and motorized units and having almost no natural boundaries for organizing anti-tank defense. It is likely that this plan was based on one of the options for an attack on the USSR, developed back in July 1940. At that time, the Chief of Staff of the 18th Army, Major General Erich Marx, based on the Guderian concept of a deep tank breakthrough, proposed creating one powerful strike group against the southern flank of the western border of the USSR, which was supposed to break through Ukraine to the Don base, bend of the Don, and from there, turning sharply to the north, to strike through the regions of Oral Voronezh to Moscow, and along the Volga to Gorky. Marx's variant was rejected. He preferred the option of General Paulus, known as the Barbarossa Plan. But, acting in accordance with the Barbarossa Plan, the Germans in 1941 did not achieve their main goals. Perhaps that is why the ideas of E. Marx were again in demand by the summer of 1942, especially since, paying tribute to the German General Staff officers, we note that the plan for the summer campaign of 1942 was seriously thought out and had an effective calculation. And yet, the seal of duality lay on it from the very beginning. German strategists tried to combine economic and far-reaching military goals. The capture of the Caucasus and the lower reaches of the Volga to Astrakhan initially laid the foundation for the inevitable division of the offensive into 2 sharply divergent directions. At the same time, the Germans clearly overestimated their strength and underestimated the capabilities of the enemy. As we will see later, the course of the military campaign redrawn the plans of both sides. And if the Soviet High Command in 1942 had to experience desperate situations threatening catastrophe, then Hitler's, the defeat of his armies and the complete collapse of the entire military-political strategy of Blitzkrieg. German 150mm FH-18 cannon, abandoned during the retreat near Kharkov in May 1942. Breakthrough to the Don. The Battle of Stalingrad was immediately preceded by heavy defeats for the Red Army. According to the plan of the Supreme High Command, it was necessary to drive the Germans out of the Crimea, unblock Sevastopol and, with a strike from the Barvankovsky Ledge to Kharkov, reach the Dnieper line, thereby preparing the conditions for a general offensive. The German command, on the contrary, planned to capture the Crimea, open the way to the Caucasus along the Black Sea coast, cut off the protrusions formed in winter and, having straightened the front, free up additional troops for a decisive breakthrough in the south. The Soviet offensive in the Crimea ended in defeat. Only 120,000 people were transported from Crimea to the Taman Peninsula. Almost all military equipment was lost. Sevastopol was surrendered. The Germans released one of their strongest armies, the 11th E. Manstein. Even more serious in its consequences was the defeat of the Southwestern and Southern Fronts, SWF and SF, which directly predetermined the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad. The offensive plan of the Southwestern Front, S. Timoshenko, member of the Military Council N. Khrushchev, Chief of Staff I. Bagramian, pursued far-reaching goals, but had significant drawbacks. The flanks and rear of the Barvankovsky Ledge were poorly covered from the south. From the Southern Front, Commander Malinovsky. Moreover, it was precisely this ledge that the Germans chose for their main attack in the south. There was a coincidence in time of the oncoming strikes. Soviet front-line reconnaissance failed to quickly reveal the concentration of enemy groupings, and when the troops of the Southwestern Front, breaking through the German defenses, successfully moved around Kharkov, they unexpectedly received blows from the 6th German Army of Paulus from the north and the 1st Tank Army of Kleist from the south, through the strip of the South Front. In the situation created on May 16 to 19, Timoshenko's decision to send Tank Corps into battle and the decision of the headquarters to suspend the entire offensive were belated, and our 6th, 57th Armies and L. Bobkin's group were surrounded. They fought until the 29th of May, but only a part of them escaped from the ring. The troops of the Southwestern Front and the South Front, not having time to gain a foothold on new lines and recuperate, with heavy losses retreated to the east, detaining the enemy for some time on the line of Boyan, Volokhanovka, Kupiansk, Slaviansk. In the meantime, the Germans, having completed preparations for the summer campaign, began to carry out the main operations according to the plan of Directive No. 41. The Wykes Army Group, consisting of the 2nd Field and 4th Tank German and 2nd Hungarian armies, broke through the defenses of the Bryansk front, rushed to Voronezh. And on June 30, 1942, the 6th Field Army of Paulus broke through on the northern flank of the SWF to a depth of 80 kilometers. Part of the formations of the Bryansk front was surrounded, but they managed to successfully, although not without losses, break out of the ring. The power and scope of the German offensive that began in the south were unexpected for the Soviet Supreme High Command, and it could not draw a confident conclusion. Where would the Germans move next after reaching the Don at Voronezh? Will they make a turn to the north and throw into the rear of the Soviet troops in the region of Yelets and Tula and further to Moscow, or will they rush on the right flank to the Caucasus, Kuban, and send the rest of the forces to intercept the Volga? Accordingly, Marshal Timoshenko received an order, firmly holding, supporting, positions on the flanks near Voronezh and Rostov, to withdraw the troops of the Southwestern Front and the Southern Front from attacks in order to avoid encirclement and, giving way to space, gain time. Commander of the German 1st Panzer Army, Field Marshal von Kleist. The German command with great perseverance sought to carry out the initial stage of the campaign in 2 operations, in the Voronezh direction, Operation Blue, and Kantamirov, Clausewitz. The second proposed, after the capture of Voronezh, to turn the 4th Panzer Army of Goff to Kantemirovka and Milarovo, where from the south, to the same point, at the junction of the Southwestern Front and the South Front, the 1st Panzer Army of Kleist was supposed to break through. Thus, the main forces of the 2 Soviet fronts fell into a huge cauldron from Voronezh to Rostov. Then the 6th Army of Paulus was to capture Stalingrad on the move, and Army Group A would move to the Caucasus. It should be noted that the German breakthrough to Voronezh and the Don line became possible not only because of the superiority of the enemy on the entire southern wing. The reason for the defeat of the Soviet troops was also incorrect and simply inept leadership on the part of the front and army commands, which did not yet have sufficient experience in conducting an offensive and defense with the participation of large masses of mobile troops. German tanks BZ.4 from the 1st Panzer Army, advancing in the area of Izium, south of Kharkov. Summer 1942. The command of the Bryansk Front, F. Gorlikov, member of the Military Council I. Susakov, Chief of Staff M. Kazakov, could not satisfactorily conduct intelligence and did not have an operational analysis of the situation. Communication with the troops and control was constantly lost. Therefore, the enemy's blows turned out to be sudden for the leadership of the front, and their own strike forces, and very significant ones, sometimes remained inactive even at turning points in the battles. So, the Tank Corps of M. Kartukov, N. Faklenko, M. Pavelkin, V. Mishulin, V. Badanov acted inconsistently in time and combat missions. When repelling the enemy offensive, they were brought into battle in parts, and not so much to destroy him, but to plug in holes in the defense. Their management was not organized, the commanders fought at their own discretion, they were afraid to break away from the infantry, were not connected with it by fire artillery support. The first formed 5th Tank Army, transferred from the Stavka Reserve, did not receive tasks at all and was not brought into battle. The headquarters, seeing the imminent threat, urgently sent the Chief of the General Staff A. Vasilevsky to Voronezh and reinforced the front with reserves. Only after that, the Wykes group was stopped by new organized counterattacks, and although the Germans broke into Voronezh in July, they could not completely take it. Soviet troops firmly held the eastern part of the city. The Voronezh front was created, Commander N. F. Vatutin. Only after that, the Wykes group was stopped by new organized counterattacks, and although the Germans broke into Voronezh in July, they could not completely take it. Soviet troops firmly held the eastern part of the city. The Voronezh front was created, Commander N. F. Vatutin. Only after that, the Wykes group was stopped by new organized counterattacks, and although the Germans broke into Voronezh in July, they could not completely take it. Soviet troops firmly held the eastern part of the city. The Voronezh front was created, Commander N. F. Vatutin. Heavy German 211mm gun mod. 1918, captured by the Soviet troops. Southern Front, May 1942. Heavy German half-track tractor, captured by the Soviet troops. Southern Front. Summer 1942. Army Group B did not fulfill the main task of Operation Blue, but the success it achieved was significant. The defense of the Soviet troops was broken through in a strip of up to 300 kilometers and to a depth of 150 to 170 kilometers. Using this success, the 6th Army of Paulis knocked down the troops of the Southwestern Front from the line near Ostrogazsk and moved south along with the 4th Panzer Gotha, threatening the rear of both fronts. By mid-July, the enemy captured on the right bank of the Don, Valuiki, Rososh, Bogacha, Kantemirovka, Milarovo. At the same time, the 1st Panzer Army, Army Group A, as envisaged by the Clausewitz Plan, broke through to Kantemirovka. However, the headquarters of the Supreme High Command unraveled the enemy's plan and made a timely decision to leave the Don base and Rostov, ordering the Soviet troops to withdraw from the armored pincers brought above them, the southern front to the left bank of the Don, and Yugozapadny to the line along the right bank of the Don. The German shock groups were closed in a ring at Kantemirovka. Milarovo was already an empty space. Hitler was angry, the Russians slipped away. Differences in his headquarters about where to send the main forces now ended in the removal of von Bock from the post of Commander of Army Group South and a significant adjustment to the plan. Thus, in the battles on the southern wing in June, early July, the German command did not achieve the main goal of the first stage of the summer campaign. It was not possible to encircle and destroy the main forces of the Soviet fronts. And this was the first failure of the Germans in the decisive campaign of the year, calculated literally by the day. The Russians did not allow themselves to be surrounded by stubborn and maneuverable defense, however, at a high price. With the breakthrough of the Germans to the Don, the transition of the Red Army to strategic defense was complicated by the heaviest losses of troops and territory. In general, the enemy achieved considerable results. He completely captured the Don base, Rostov, went to the Big Bend of the Don, created a direct threat to Stalingrad and the North Caucasus. The plan of the Nazi command became clear to the headquarters of the Supreme High Command, to intercept the Volga with a strike on Stalingrad and, having cut off the entire south, to throw all their forces into capturing the oil-bearing regions of the Caucasus. Artillery crew of the 76mm regimental gun firing at the enemy. Southern Front. Summer 1942. A fiery tornado between the Don and the Volga. Plans are changing. With the release of the 6th Field Army of F. Paulus on July 17 to the line of the Cher River, the Battle of Stalingrad, defensive period, began. As early as July 12, the headquarters of the Supreme High Command urgently began to form a new Stalingrad front on the basis of the Southwestern Front. Commander S. Timoshenko, from 23.07 v. Gordov, member of the Military Council N. Khrushchev, Chief of Staff P. Bodin, from 23.07 d. Nikishev. During this period, the underestimation by the headquarters of the serious danger posed to the entire Soviet-German front by the southern direction, the remoteness of reserves from it and the haste of conducting spring offensive operations had a hard effect. The erroneousness of the march decisions became clear to Stalin, under whose pressure they were taken, but he, according to G.K. Zhukov, knowing about his own miscalculations and mistakes, did not look for the guilty among others, although there were enough guilty of failures and defeats. Off. Then I'm afraid that you would have been treated cool. The Soviet crew of a 122mm howitzer, covering the gun in a beam, fires at the enemy. Southern Front, June 1942. The Stalingrad front was being created on the move, already under fire. Armies for him, 62nd, 63rd, 64th, were transferred from remote centers. Due to the overload of transport, the troops were brought up separately, in parts, and after forced marches of 150 to 200 kilometers across the hot steppe, subjected to continuous enemy bombardment, they occupied hastily prepared positions or went into battle on the move. The most distinguished armies in the battle were commanded by the following generals: the 62nd, V. Kolpakchi, until 3.08, A. Lopathin, from 3.08 to 5.09, V. Chuikov, from 10.09, 63rd, V. Kuznetsov, 64th, V. Chuikov, from 10.06 to 4.08, M. Shumilov, from 4.08. On the basis of the 28th and 38th Armies, weakened in battles, the 1st and 4th Tank Armies were formed, commanders K. Moskalenko and V. Kryuchenko, for their staffing divisions and tank units still had to arrive from the reserve, and they joined the battles only at the end of July. The 8th Air Army was included in the front, replenishing it with 20 air regiments, a total of about 200 aircraft, and promptly subordinated the Volga military flotilla. Tractor ZIS, 5 Notipools and anti-aircraft gun into position. Southern Front, summer 1942. German 105mm FH-18 40th howitzer captured by Soviet troops. Southern Front, summer 1942. In the rear of the front, the 13th, 22nd, 23rd Tank and 3rd Cavalry Corps were assigned for replenishment after the battles. By July 20, the front had 38 divisions, but only 18 of them were completed. We had 2500 to 4000 people each, and another 14 numbered from 300 to 1000 people. The front was tasked with covering a strip of 530 kilometers, from Pavlovsk along the left bank of the Don to Kletskaya and south through Surovikino to Verkhnaya Moravskaya, to take on the blow of a powerful grouping, to hold a large bend of the Don and prevent the enemy from breaking through to the Volga. Defense lines, 63rd, from Pavlovsk to Serafimovichi, 62nd, from Kletskaya to Surovikino, 64th, from Surovikino to Verkhnaya Moravskaya, Scheme 3. Scheme 3. Defensive battles in the Stalingrad direction from July 17 to September 1942. In the first 6 days, from July 17 to July 23, the situation on the Don's right beret heated up by leaps and bounds. Immediately began the race to be the first to the lines of attack and defense. The Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies hastily advanced towards the columns of the 6th Army of Paulus hurrying to the Don. And oddly enough, the non-mechanized Soviet troops were still ahead of the Germans. The commanders, gaining time for the deployment of the main forces in the main positions, managed to advance to the line of the river. Cher advanced detachments, which put up such fierce resistance that it became clear to the German generals that they could not break through to the Don crossings on the move. For the Germans, who believed that the Russians had already been largely defeated, the appearance of new armies was completely unexpected. On the very first day of the fighting, July 17, Paulus, having come across a stubborn defense, requested reinforcements and 6 days later, on July 23, received 5 infantry, 3 tank and 2 motorized divisions, which were removed from Voronezh and from the main Caucasian direction. By July 23, the Paulus group consisted of 270,000 people, 500 tanks, 3,000 guns and 1,200 aircraft. And all this against our 160,000 people, 400 tanks, 2,200 guns and 450 aircraft. Soviet armificers and infantrymen are firing at enemy aircraft. Southern Front, summer 1942. Superiority in people, 1.7 times, in artillery and tanks, 1.3 times, and in aircraft almost 3 times. But even these forces will not be enough for the Germans to quickly reach the Volga. The grouping operating against the Stalingrad front will be constantly strengthened by German formations transferred from other sectors, and the 8th Italian and 3rd Romanian armies will be put forward to replace the withdrawn German units. For 6 fiery days and nights, the advanced detachments of the Soviet troops held back the onslaught of the enemy, giving their armies time to prepare at the main lines. And these battles created new difficulties for the Hitlerite command in carrying out their plans. After the breakthrough to Voronezh, Hitler happily told F. Halder that the Russians are finished, and he agreed with the Führer, but as an experienced general staff officer, very evasively, I must admit that it seems to be the way it is. Now the German generals were forced to change the entire campaign plan, timing and alignment of groups, and transfer significant forces from the main to the auxiliary direction. With their illogical determination to defend themselves even in a hopeless situation, the Russians were clearly imposing their will on the Germans. And this was the second slip of the plan. By order of the State Defense Committee and the headquarters, the command of the Stalingrad front, together with local authorities, headed by the secretary of the regional committee, A.S. Chuyanov, prepared the defense of the Interfluve and the city. Stalingrad was covered from the west by semicircles contours, external, 500 kilometers, middle, 150 kilometers, internal, 70 kilometers and urban, 45 kilometers. 225,000 people were mobilized to build fortifications to help engineer units. Worker squads, militia units and destruction battalions were created in the city. All enterprises switched to the production of weapons, ammunition, and other products necessary for the front, and this played a role in the outcome of the battle. The July battles from July 17 to July 30, 1942 on the Don Line and in the southern Interfluve were of extreme importance for the high commands of both belligerents, as evidenced by 2 documents that are almost simultaneous in terms of the dates of appearance, July the 23rd and 28th, although the motives of the decisions set forth in them fundamentally different. We are talking about Hitler's new Directive No. 45, as a change and addition to the original No. 41, and Stalin's Order No. 227, which received the name, not a step back. Directive No. 45 approved Hitler's decision to transfer the main strike forces, in particular the 4th Panzer Army of Goth, to the Stalingrad direction, and ordered to quickly surround the new Russian grouping in the Interfluve of the Don and Volga and capture Stalingrad. In the Caucasian direction, instead of 4, only 2 German Army, 17th Field and 1st Tank, and formations of Allied Romanians. Thus, the Stalingrad direction became decisive for July-August, and the achievement of the main goal, the Caucasus, was pushed back to the period following the capture of the city. Hitler and his higher staffs proceeded from the conviction that the hastily created Stalingrad front would not be able to withstand the pressure of the armored fists of the Wehrmacht for a long time, so the task of intercepting the Volga would be solved in the shortest possible time. The Soviet High Command noticed this turn and took into account that groups A and B began to attack in divergent directions. The arc of the front increased from 500 to 2,000 kilometers, from Tuapse along the Cuban line to Rostov, Stalingrad, Voronezh. The operational depth was 750 kilometers. The offensive of Army Group B was drawn out in a narrow wedge with weakly covered flanks, but the German generals, confident in the rapid collapse of the Russian armies, considered this not dangerous. Stalin's well-known Order No. 227 is still often reduced to only repressive measures and discarded the political and moral aspects of this document, dictated by patriotic pain for the fate of the motherland, which found itself in the face of a mortal threat. And cowards, to restore order and discipline at all levels, to stop retreating moods with an iron hand, because there really was nowhere to retreat further in the military-political sense. We have already lost a huge territory, lost industrial areas and grain sources, and could lose oil. As for punitive measures, it is pointless to give them a moral assessment. Such measures are natural and common in a critical situation in a war. Since the time of ancient Rome, the harsh military law of decimation has been known. The history of warfare gives us many examples when different peoples and different political regimes resorted to such exceptional measures. In 1941, near Moscow, blocking detachments, penal battalions also appeared in the German army, and more than 60,000 military personnel of all ranks, including top generals, were subjected to repressions, up to execution, by execution. So, the commander of the tank group Gebner was sentenced to death for retreating near Moscow. It is curious that Hitler, who underestimated the strength of the Russians, understood the assessments of our defeats and losses set out in Order No. 227 as confirmation of his predictions about the imminent complete defeat of the Russians in the south, and this once again confirmed him in his decision to immediately capture Stalingrad. When different peoples and different political regimes resorted to such exceptional measures, in 1941, near Moscow, blocking detachments, penal battalions also appeared in the German army, and more than 60,000 military personnel of all ranks, including top generals, were subjected to repressions, up to execution, by execution. So, the commander of the tank group Gebner was sentenced to death for retreating near Moscow. It is curious that Hitler, who underestimated the strength of the Russians, understood the assessments of our defeats and losses set out in Order No. 227 as confirmation of his predictions about the imminent complete defeat of the Russians in the south, and this once again confirmed him in his decision to immediately capture Stalingrad. When different peoples and different political regimes resorted to such exceptional measures, in 1941, near Moscow, blocking detachments, penal battalions also appeared in the German army, and more than 60,000 military personnel of all ranks, including top generals, were subjected to repressions, up to execution, by execution. So, the commander of the tank group Gebner was sentenced to death for retreating near Moscow. It is curious that Hitler, who underestimated the strength of the Russians, understood the assessments of our defeats and losses set out in Order No. 227 as confirmation of his predictions about the imminent complete defeat of the Russians in the south, and this once again confirmed him in his decision to immediately capture Stalingrad. Up to execution, more than 60,000 military personnel of all ranks, including top generals, were exposed. So, the commander of the tank group Gebner was sentenced to death for retreating near Moscow. It is curious that Hitler, who underestimated the strength of the Russians, understood the assessments of our defeats and losses set out in Order No. 227 as confirmation of his predictions about the imminent complete defeat of the Russians in the south, and this once again confirmed him in his decision to immediately capture Stalingrad. Up to execution, more than 60,000 military personnel of all ranks, including top generals, were exposed. So, the commander of the tank group Gebner was sentenced to death for retreating near Moscow. It is curious that Hitler, who underestimated the strength of the Russians, understood the assessments of our defeats and losses set out in Order No. 227 as confirmation of his predictions about the imminent complete defeat of the Russians in the south, and this once again confirmed him in his decision to immediately capture Stalingrad. Hitler demanded from the generals the speedy implementation of Directive No. 45, and the command of Army Group B decided to capture Stalingrad on the move. The plan of action, at first glance, was simple and sufficiently provided with forces. It was assumed that the 6th Army of Paulus from the farm of Perelazovsky and the 4th Panzer Army of Goff from Oblivskaya with covering attacks at different times on Kalach were closed in a ring on the right bank of the Don by the Soviet 62nd and the 64th Army, and then, having crossed the Don, they will break into Stalingrad with a blow in a straight line from Kalach. Scheme 4. Scheme 4. The German planned to encircle the Soviet armies in the bend of the Don and capture Stalingrad at the end of the summer of 1942. From the air, the ground forces of the Wehrmacht were supported by the 4th Air Fleet of Richthofen, reinforced by the 8th Air Corps, which had Hitler's order to wipe Stalingrad off the face of the earth. Hitler himself, at his headquarters, located at that time in Ukraine, in Vinnytsia, assured Paulus that his left flank to Voronezh would be covered by the 8th Italian Army arriving there, and expressed the hope that the valiant 6th would quickly crush the remnants of the Russians and march in 3 to 4 crossings. The remaining 170 to 180 kilometers to Stalingrad will pass. Paulus launched an offensive on July 23, massing tank and motorized divisions against the right flank of the 62nd Army. Scheme 3 and 5. Scheme 5. Disruption of the German plan to encircle the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies on the Don. Counterattacks of the Soviet 1st and 4th Tank Armies in July 1942. Hundreds of planes shredded its main strip, but the Soviet units, having withstood the pressure, threw back the German motorized infantry with counterattacks, and the tanks met with fire from anti-tank guns, armor-piercers and air strikes. In one of the sections, 4 armor-piercers, having entered into battle with 30 German tanks, destroyed half of them. Along the entire line of Soviet defense, the Germans faced stubborn resistance. Only 3 days later they reached Kamensk, and only by August 1st to 2nd, having pressed the flank of the 62nd, made their way in 2 small sections near Kalak to the Don. The commander of the Stalingrad front, V. Gordov, decided to bring into battle the 1st and 4th Tank Armies, which had not yet completed the formation. By order of the headquarters, they had to carry out the formation on July 22nd to 28th. Gordov, due to the worsening situation, reduced it by 2 days, and from July 26th, the strikes of the Soviet tank armies, coordinated with the counterattacks of the defending units, thwarted the Germans' attempt to force the Don. The arrow of the German strike at Kalak slowed down. Paulus took time to regroup his troops and replenish. On the southern front, the 4th Panzer Army of Gotha, deployed from the Caucasus to the Stalingrad direction, consisting of 8 infantry, 2 tank and 2 motorized divisions and reinforced by the 6th Romanian Corps, went on the offensive on July 31st. Easily breaking through the defenses of the 51st Army, which had only 3,000 men in a strip of 200 kilometers, the Germans began to advance along the Tikoretsk-Stalingrad railway. The 64th Army, having an open flank due to the retreat, retreated under overwhelming pressure to the left bank of the Don. Gordo, at the direction of the Stavka, created an operational group headed by V. Chuikov, 3 divisions, tank and naval brigades, which, slowly retreating to the line of the Aksai River, held back the German infantry divisions with counterattacks until August 5th. But Goth's tanks advanced aggressively and, bypassing Chuikov's group on the left, occupied Kotelnikovo on August 3rd, and on August 6th they reached the line of Abganerovo, Lake Tsatsa, Junction, 74 kilometers, and moved to the station Tinguta. Only 30 kilometers from Stalingrad was it possible to slow down this second, aimed at the city, southern, arrow. And although the German attempt to capture Stalingrad on the move failed, a serious threat loomed over the city from the south. The front command immediately moved F. Tolbukin's 57th Army from the headquarters reserved to the Abganerovo-Raygorod line, aiming it at restoring and strengthening the broken defense along the outer contour. Thus, in July, the command of the newly formed front managed to first slow down and then repel the first blows of the German shock groups in front of the outer contour, but the position of the front became more and more complicated. The length of its defense line was extended to 800 kilometers, the number of armies and formations attached to them increased, and the difficulties of organizing combat operations of troops forced to repel the onslaught of superior enemy forces in 2 disconnected directions also increased. Damaged and abandoned Soviet T-34 tanks during the retreat. A German self-propelled gun Stug .3 is visible on the road. Southern Front, summer 1942. On August 5, 1942, the Stavka divides the front into 2, Southeastern, commanded by Colonel General A. I. Eremenko, member of the Military Council N. Khrushchev, Chief of Staff M. Zakharov, as part of the 51st, 57th, 64th Armies, the 13th Tank Corps and the 8th Air Army, T. Kryukin, and Stalingrad, Commander V. Gordov, as part of the 62nd, 63rd, 21st Armies and the 4th Tank Army, as well as the 28th Th Tank Corps. The solution was not the best. It complicated the massive use of aviation, tore the organization of the city's defense measures in 2, and already on August 9, the Stalingrad front was quickly subordinated to A. Eremenko. But again, the city was divided by a delimitation line of fronts, at the direction of Stalin, who considered that this would more reliably ensure his defense. Both fronts are equally responsible for Stalingrad. Besides, in August, tensions in the Stalingrad direction grew. The German command, although it ran into a decisive rebuff, but, having achieved tactical success, sought to carry out its plan to encircle the 62nd and 64th Armies. Paulus, forced to regroup for almost a week on the defensive, on August 7 to 9 launched a new offensive in the Kalachinsky sector. Having sealed the shock wedge, the Germans pushed back the 62nd Soviet Army west of Kalak with a massive pressure of tanks, artillery fire and aviation. The commander of the 62nd Army, A. Lopatin, launched a flank counterattack by a group of 3 divisions, which caused significant losses to the Germans, but were themselves squeezed from 3 sides and fought heavy battles until August 14, Scheme 5. Lopatin led the main forces to the left bank of the Don, taking up defense on the outer contour in the Vertiachi-Lyapichev section. The advance of the Germans was again suspended, but the situation remained critical, as Paulus was building up his forces and preparing a new, even more powerful blow. A. Eremenko reported the situation to headquarters. Her decision was unexpected. From August 13, He was appointed commander of both fronts. His deputies were, for Stalingrad, V. Gordov, for the southeastern, F. Gorlikov. Under one commander, there were now two headquarters, two front departments, an exceptional case, perhaps without precedent in the past. Nevertheless, this allowed for more flexible interaction and maneuvering of the forces and means of the fronts, so the unification as a whole turned out to be effective. On the southern face, now the zone of the SEF, the 4th Panzergotha continued to tear along the railway and, turning to the Satyrs, tried to reach Kalak towards the 6th Paulis. Particularly fierce battles took place in the defense sectors of the 64th Army north of Kotelnikovo. Blows and counterblows followed one after another. The 74-kilometer junction passed from hand to hand several times. In order to eliminate the threat of a breakthrough to Stalingrad from the south, the UVF command organized on August 9, with strong aviation support, a counterattack which went down in the history of the battle as Battles in the Area of St. Abganarovo, Scheme 6. Scheme 6. Counterattack of the southeastern front in the Abganarovo area in August 1942. A column of armored personnel carriers of the motorized division, Grossdeutschland. Western bank of the Don, summer 1942. The counterattack was carried out by a group consisting of the 13th Tank Corps, 38 tanks, the 133rd Tank Brigade, 21 tanks, and the 204th Division. Supported by the Army Artillery Strike Group, they launched a frontal assault on the Satyrs, while the 38th Division flanked from Farm No. 3. Goth had one armored and two full army corps here. The disparity in forces is huge, and yet the Soviet command, aware of the danger of a breakthrough to the city, went on this bold, albeit risky, enterprise. There were few forces, but the superior enemy was opposed by a skillful battle formation, the first echelon, tanks, the second, 4 anti-tank regiments, IPTAP, the third echelon, 2 Katyusha regiments. Such a formation allowed all the echelons to simultaneously participate in the battle. Destroyed German tank PZ.3J, spare caterpillars on the front of the tank are suspended to strengthen the frontal armor. Summer 1942. German tanks of the 4th Panzer Army on the outskirts of Stalingrad. Summer 1942. The battle was opened with a volley of Katyushas, then our tanks and infantry rushed into the attack. Artillery knocked out German tanks and also covered the German support motorized infantry. The fighting lasted for several days. As a result, the Germans lost up to 3 infantry regiments, about 100 tanks, dozens of guns and mortars and other equipment. The 4th Panzer Army of Hoth was driven back beyond the outer contour and went on the defensive, and the headquarters of Group B was forced to urgently reinforce it with 2 divisions, tank and infantry, taken from the 6th Army. The southern arrow of the German offensive stopped. The troops of the left flank of the UVF covered the most important section of Krasnoarmeysk, Bekitovka near the bend of the Volga. It is curious that the commanders of the German 4th Panzer, in order to justify their failure, referred to the numerical superiority of the Russians, the lack of fuel, the heat, and even fields with high corn and sunflowers, covering the view of tanks and infantry. This information is given by the German General G. in the book, The March on Stalingrad. In mid-August, Paulis, continuing his fierce pressure on the flanks of the 62nd Army, prepared to strike at the Soviet 4th Panzer Army of Kryuchenko in order to reach the bend of the Don, where the river comes closest to the Volga. When, on the night of August 14, Eremenko arrived at the headquarters of the Stalingrad front to Gordov, the following situation developed there. The main means of strengthening the front were on the right wing, in the sector of the 21st Army beyond the Don, east of Sofimovichi, 2 artillery regiments, 2 tank battalions, regiments, Katyusha and several IPTAP, and in order to transfer them to repel a German attack, it took at least 30 to 40 hours. But Paulis preempted, starting the offensive after 12 hours, on the morning of August 15. Reserves from the right wing, arriving scattered, I had to repel blows on the move, upon arrival. The units removed from the UVF sites did not have time to fully arrive either. And the enemy in the strip from Malokletskaya to the Bolshinobatovsky farm concentrated against 2 Soviet armies, 62nd and 4th Tank, 5 infantry, 2 tank and 1st motorized divisions. And although the 4th Panzer resisted fiercely, the Germans managed to break through its defenses and break the army into 2 groups. The right, 3 divisions, withdrew to the northeast, joined the 1st Guards Army, which arrived from the reserve, and received the task of defending the Kremenskaya-Sirotinskaya mouth of the river along the Don line. Ilovlaya. 2 tank and 1 motorized divisions. And although the 4th Panzer resisted fiercely, the Germans managed to break through its defenses and break the army into 2 groups. The right, 3 divisions, withdrew to the northeast, joined the 1st Guards Army, which arrived from the reserve, and received the task of defending the Kremenskaya-Sirotinskaya mouth of the river along the Don line. Ilovlaya. 2 tank and 1 motorized divisions. And although the 4th Panzer resisted fiercely, the Germans managed to break through its defenses and break the army into 2 groups. The right, 3 divisions, withdrew to the northeast, joined the 1st Guards Army, which arrived from the reserve, and received the task of defending the Kremenskaya-Sirotinskaya mouth of the river along the Don line. Ilovlaya. German officers from the 4th Panzer Army during reconnaissance in the Don steppes. An armored personnel carrier SD is used as a hill. KFZ 251. German 4-axle reconnaissance armored car SD, KFZ 232 with 20mm cannon and loop antenna. Kalmyk steppes, summer 1942. The left group, pushed back to the left bank, took up defensive positions on the section of the river. Ilovlaya, Nizhny-Nilovskaya on the outer bypass. The 62nd Army held the Nizhny-Niloviki-Lyapuchev section on the left bank of the Don and covered the shortest route to Stalingrad in a straight line from the west. In these fiery August days, all the divisions of the Stalingrad front, which initially entered the battle in a large shortage, suffered heavy losses, and only the courage and stamina of the fighters and commanders and the operational skill of the generals made it possible to repel the onslaught of the enemy with great damage to him. As a result of the fighting on August 17 to 18, using the numerical and technical superiority and the delay of the command of the Stalingrad front with the regrouping, Paulus was finally able to complete the immediate task, to reach the Don in the large section of Trekostrovsky, Bolshinobatovsky and take up initial positions for crossing the river. The command of Army Group B, reinforcing the strike force, hurried Paulus with the crossing, and demanded that Goth break through to Krasnoarmeysk. It was no coincidence that this area attracted Nazi strategists. Here lay one of the most important features of the area of the Battle of Stalingrad in its defensive period. The fact is that, as a theater of military operations, the Stalingrad operational area is a flat terrain with access to the Don and Kalmyk steppes. In its center is the city of Stalingrad, stretching for 60 kilometers along the Volga from north to south. And at the very southern end of the city blocks is a site of critical importance for the entire operational area. These are small Volga uplands between Bekitovka and Krasnoarmeysk. Here, where the Volga turns sharply to the southeast and goes in a straight line to Astrakhan, the coast rises to 150 m. This hill dominates the entire bend of the river and Sapinsky Island. It is here that the key to Stalingrad is located. The interception of the Volga in this place would be fatal for the city and, moreover, for the entire southern, left, wing of the front. Furthermore, German armored vehicles prepared for the attack. The flat surface of the Don and Volga steppes is an ideal place for the use of tank and motorized formations. The capture of this sector made it possible for complete control and observation both to the east, across the Volga, and to the west, to the Kalmyk steppes, and provided both sides with an advantageous springboard for both defense and offensive. The German and Soviet command knew the key importance of this section near Krasnoarmeysk. Therefore, its strengthening began immediately and simultaneously with the creation of the Southeastern Front. Already on August 13, Soviet troops withdrawn from the border of the river Aksai to the Demkin, to Bektanorovo section, condensed the defense between the Aksai and Mishkova rivers. Dense minefields were laid there, forming a forefield where the forward detachments of the 64th Army defended themselves, and general and especially anti-tank reserves were concentrated in the rear, a rifle division, an anti-tank brigade and 2 anti-tank regiments. The 57th Army was also deployed here. Eremenko remarks, if such an opportunity, to strengthen the sector north of Stalingrad, presented itself in the zone of the Stalingrad front, then the enemy would never see the Volga. In the days when Paulus was making his way to his starting positions to jump across the Don, Goth, having replenished the army with fresh divisions, tried to capture the Keystone Point, which would allow him to turn over the whole of Stalingrad. With 2 infantry and 1 motorized divisions, Goth struck in the areas of Abganorovo, crossing 74 kilometers, Demkin, Agriculturalvam, Yerkin. Fierce fighting ended only with the capture of Abganorovo. Then, already with a grouping of 3 infantry, 2 tank and 1 motorized divisions, The Germans hit Krasnoarmeysk and Bekitovka from the Plodorovo area and broke through to the Okovrag, Morozovskaya Gully, but, trying to deepen the breakthrough, they ran into minefields and the fire of anti-tank regiments. The armored fist has lost its strength. These days, German commanders, bringing into battle 100 to 150 tanks and infantry regiments, after the 4th of May attacks per day, they lost up to 50% of their tanks and up to 40% of the personnel of the regiments. And although the losses of the Soviet troops were by no means less, it became clear to the German command that the plan to capture the city on the move was impossible. Soviet infantrymen from the 64th Army are preparing to repel the attack of German tanks. Western bank of the Don, July-August 1942. German 6-barreled rocket mortar at the exhibition of captured equipment in Vladikavkaz, Ordzhonikidze. The same ones were used near Stalingrad. During these days of bloody battles, Goebbels propagandists started talking about the appearance of the Stalingrad Fortress among the Russians on the Volga, surpassing the famous Verdun in its impregnability. The world press assessed the situation differently, cautiously declaring that the Germans seemed to be bogged down again, this time near Stalingrad. Hitler and his generals were discouraged by such stubborn resistance from the Soviet troops. They did not expect that, in their opinion, the Russian armies, disorganized in June and small in number, would be able to stop the German march to the Volga. For a month from July 17 to August 17, German troops, superior to the Russians in everything, advanced only 60 to 80 kilometers, this is 2 kilometers per day. Hitler was extremely dissatisfied with the actions of the commanders of the 6th and 4th Armies. 2 terms for the capture of Stalingrad, appointed by him personally, passed, but Paulus and Goff still did not surround and destroy the Russians on the right bank of the Don, but trampled in the Interfluve. Stalingrad, like a pump, drew in more and more forces and reserves. The most valuable time was irrevocably gone, the fate of the entire summer campaign was broken and collapsed. Hitler was nervous and demanded, at any cost, to take Stalingrad or wipe it off the map. After the attempt to capture Stalingrad by simultaneous strikes failed, the command of Army Group B decided to capture the city with simultaneous concentric strikes. The 6th Army of Paulus advanced from Trekostrovsky to the northern outskirts and to the center of Stalingrad, and the 4th Panzer Gotha, from Abganorovo, fertile to the southern outskirts, Scheme 7. To ensure a junction between the armies, they planned a blow from Kalak to the east. The authors of this plan were, apparently, Paulus himself and his chief of staff, General Schmidt. In any case, the plan is set out signed by Paulus in the Army Order for the Attack on Stalingrad, dated August 19, 1942, at 1845. In the plan, it was prudently supposed to close the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies into a ring with encircling wedges, and with a blow from Kalak to break the joint between them and destroy them in 2 semi-boilers. Wedge from farm. Trekostrovsky through the hut. Verchiki on the Rinok took into account the lack of a fortified defense sector similar to Krasnoarmeysk on the northern tip of the city among the Russians. And the wedge of the 4th tank passed from the south, bypassing the key section of Krasnoarmeysk, Bekitovka. This brought the strike groups closer together, and thus improved their interaction and increased strike power. The shift of the 4th Panzer to the left of Krasnoarmeysk was not due to an underestimation of the corner point of Stalingrad, but the fear that Hoff would again get bogged down in fruitless battles for the heights and the whole plan would lose its meaning. Experience has been taken into account. Thus, improved their interaction and increased striking power. The shift of the 4th Panzer to the left of Krasnoarmeysk was not due to an underestimation of the corner point of Stalingrad, but the fear that Hoff would again get bogged down in fruitless battles for the heights and the whole plan would lose its meaning. Experience has been taken into account. Thus, improved their interaction and increased striking power. The shift of the 4th Panzer to the left of Krasnoarmeysk was not due to an underestimation of the corner point of Stalingrad, but the fear that Hoff would again get bogged down in fruitless battles for the heights and the whole plan would lose its meaning. Experience has been taken into account. The calculation of the anti-aircraft, Maxim, fires at enemy aircraft. Stalingrad front, late summer 1942. Paulus, as the senior commander to whom the 4th Panzer Army of Goth was operationally subordinate, concentrated tank corps on the flanks of the grouping, in the north, 2 tank and 2 motorized divisions, and in the south, 3 tank and 2 motorized divisions. In the center, from Kalak, he advanced 9 infantry divisions. The grouping outnumbered the Soviet troops by 2 times, by artillery by 1.5, by aircraft by 3, by tanks by 4 times. Already on the day the order was signed, the Sixth Army launched attacks in order to force the Don. A new stage of defense began, battles on the outer and middle contours. The first attempt by the Germans to cross at Nizhny Akatov and Nizhny Gerasimov ended in the complete destruction of the German units that had crossed. After that, Paulus transferred attacks to Verchiki and Peskovatka, created multiple superiority in a narrow area, pulling 6 divisions here, 2 motorized, tank and 3 infantry, reinforced by artillery. These forces, with continuous massive air support, created a fire shield covering the crossings from all the fire weapons of tank and motorized divisions and field artillery. This onslaught was resisted only by the 98th Division of Colonel I. Barinov, later I. Sergeyev, and 3 battalions of the 54th Fortified Area, Colonel M. Karnachev. Gordov and Lopatin immediately transferred the 87th Division, Colonel Kazartsev, 2 IPTAPs and other units to help. In the fierce battles of attack-counterattack, the Germans were able to advance only where there was not a single defender left in positions. By the end of August 20th, Paulus still managed to literally squeeze 2 of his divisions into a small bridgehead, and by the end of August 21st, he had transported 2 more. But then, due to heavy losses, he was forced to pause in order to prepare an armored wedge for a throw at Stalingrad on August 23rd. The breakthrough to Stalingrad to the Rinnokusovka section took place in a critical situation that had developed for the troops of the front. Even during the days of fighting on August 15th to 21st, the Unified Command revealed in general terms the intention of the enemy and the new operational plan for capturing the city from 2 directions. Both were dangerous, but special attention was paid to the southern direction, with key heights near the bend of the Volga. A breakthrough to them threatened with disaster. Our reserves were constantly thrown up there. In the center and along the entire northern front, the small number of Soviet troops and the lack of combat means did not allow the creation of large reserve fists, and enemy attacks were repelled only by the transfer of units from unattacked sectors. Paulus' jump across the Don and the throw to the Volga, supported by an unprecedentedly massive air strike on the city, turned out to be sudden not in design and time, but in its power. T-34 tanks manufactured by the Stalingrad tractor plant are being prepared for shipment to the front. August 1942. Many days of the Battle of Stalingrad were heavy or terrible. But August 23, 1942 can rightfully be called a hellish day. Below is a picture based on the memoirs of a direct participant in those tragic events and a witness to this terrible day, marked by pitch flames. The participants in those events acted at different levels and watched this hell from different points, from the command posts of the fronts and armies, divisions and regiments, from the soldiers' trenches or from the streets of the city, but with a single strong-willed feeling: resist. No matter what. A.I. Eremenko testifies. In the morning the telephones were red-hot from disturbing reports. At 8 o'clock, from the headquarters of the 62nd, the enemy, supported by large masses of aviation and artillery, launched strong attacks from Vertiachi, aiming through the strip of Bolshaya and Malaya Rososhka at Stalingrad. It became clear, Paulus decided on a breakthrough. Immediately, the headquarters began organizing counterattacks, looking for everything that could be thrown into battle. But the superiority of the enemy is great, events are accelerating almost by the minute. At 8:20 a.m., a report came from Seleznev, Chief of Staff of the 8th Air Army. The pilots found 2 columns of 100 tanks each, followed by solid columns of vehicles with infantry. Everything was on fire on the Malaya Rososhka line. I order Seleznev and Kryukin, commander of the aviation of the UVF, immediately raise all the aircraft of Stalingrad and all attack aircraft and hit the tanks and motorized infantry. 9 o'clock, a call from E. Reining, head of the Air Defense Corps. The Germans go to Bolshaya Rososhka, already. I order fire on aircraft and direct fire on tanks. 10 o'clock, an order to the head of the tank troops of the front A. Shtevnev, to delay the dispatch of 2 tank corps for formation, hit the Germans on the flank from the northwest, and in the corps there are only 20 to 25 tanks, and mostly light T-70s, and this is against hundreds of German armored personnel carrier SD, KFZ, 251-3A at the pontoon ferry across the Don. August 1942. Scheme 7. Paulus planned to capture Stalingrad with concentric strikes on August 19, 1942. With great effort, I force myself to remain calm. A really difficult situation has arisen, the fate of Stalingrad, and, possibly, of the entire 1942 campaign, is being decided. And there are almost no troops in the city. The danger of capture is exceptionally great. A call from the head of military communications, a Korshunov, voice dropped, confused. The echelon with replenishment and ammunition has been broken. The German tanks are going to Stalingrad. What should we do? I answer sharply, put an end to panic, serve. 11 o'clock, an order to the head of the garrison of the city of Sarajevo. 2 regiments, together with their defense artillery divisions, close the northwestern and western directions to the city. To help put forward a reserve regiment to the plant, barricades. 12 o'clock, reports of the deputy for the southeast F. Gorlikov and the chief of staff G. Zakharov, 4th Tank Gotha occupied St. Tinguta and the junction, 74 kilometers, recaptured in other areas. Our 38th Division is fighting in semi-encirclement. We are preparing a counterattack. My solution, to strengthen the counterattack with the 56th Tank Brigade from the reserve. The enemy's plan is being finally clarified, with 2 wedges, as expected, to break into Stalingrad. Events are condensed. I barely managed to report the situation to the General Staff. A call from Lopathin, 62nd. The enemy, about 250 tanks and 1,000 vehicles with infantry, crushed the regiment of the 87th and the flank of the 35th Divisions. Order, close the gap with your reserve, throw the enemy away from the middle line. And immediately 2 reports, Raining, Sarev and the 10th Division of the NKVD are already fighting in the Orlovka area. I decide which parts to allocate to them for reinforcement. A call from the tractor plant from V. Malishev, a representative of the State Defense Committee. German tanks are moving to the market, our anti-aircraft gunners are fighting with them, shells are exploding at the plant. Objects are prepared for the explosion. I order, do not blow up. Scheme 8. Breakthrough of the 6th Army of Paulus to the Volga in the Tomilin area, and counterattacks of the Soviet troops in August-September 1942. Working squad, into battle. Protect the plant at all costs. The city's factories give 20 guns and 10 tanks daily. General Faklenko intercepts Malishev's phone. He was ordered to defend the plant with the help of the training center, 2,000 people and 30 tanks. I send 2 brigades to help, tank and rifle. General Shestakov and Anisimov arrived with a report. The floating bridge from Traktorny across the Volga was built ahead of schedule in 10 days. I order to declare gratitude to the builders and to destroy the bridge immediately. Both involuntarily take a step back in mute surprise. Is everything in order with the commander's head? Brief explanation, German tanks can slip through. Bridge to destroy. The shocked generals leave to carry out the order. And the only, it seems, on this day a gratifying report, the 124th Brigade of Colonel Gorokov is crossing the Volga. I order, brigade on the move, from ferries, to hit the enemy and throw him away from the tractor plant. But the worst is yet to come. Exactly at 18:00, up to 600 German aircraft launched a massive attack on the entire city at once. A report of their approach was received within 5 minutes. I feel how strongly my heart beat, how drops of sweat appeared on my forehead. The thought unbearably drilled into my brain, all our aviation is in the air, but the city itself, is almost defenseless. In a few minutes, it turned into a fiery hell. Entire neighborhoods, primarily wooden buildings, instantly disappeared. In the roar of explosions, stone buildings cracked, exposing mutilated iron frames, brick and metal melted in the fire, oil from the storage facilities poured into the Volga, turning it into a sea of fire and throwing fiery tongues of flame and black smoke up to the sky. And along the streets, looking for salvation, thousands of city residents rushed about and died from fragments, bullets, fire and suffocation, women, children, old people. The hearts of the fighters contracted in pain. The mind could not put up with the impossibility of preventing the torment of people. Hatred for the fascist fanatics shook the souls. Anti-aircraft gunners from 500 guns fired until their barrels jammed. The pilots, having shot all the cartridges, went to ram, and 90 Black Cross planes crashed into the hell they had created. This is the vision of this day from the command post of the front. German commanders armored personnel carrier SD, KFZ 251 from the SS Panzer Division, Giant of Germany, crossed the Don. Summer 1942. The Germans knew perfectly well that there were no troops directly in the city, as well as serious operational and tactical goals, but embittered by the stubbornness of the defense, the disruption of their plans, failures and losses, they deliberately set the goal to subject Stalingrad to continuous bombardment, destroy as many buildings and people, sow panic among the population of the city, paralyze the will of its defenders and force them to surrender. It was precisely this understanding of this barbaric bombing that was expressed by the German officer from the 267th Regiment of the 94th Infantry Division, Wilhelm Hoffmann, in his diary, which later fell into our hands. Stalingrad is put on fire by order of the Führer. So these Russians, need to stop resisting. At 9 p.m. on August 23, at the command post of the Southeastern Front, Vasilevsky and Eremenko summed up the endlessly difficult day. Here were N.S. Khrushchev, A. Malyshev, A. S. Chuyanov and GKO member G. K. Malenkov. The city, which continued to be subjected to airstrikes, was ablaze with a giant fire so that one could read a newspaper 70 kilometers from it. There was no wired connection with Moscow. The report was sent to Stalin by radio. The enemy made his way to the Volga along a narrow corridor 9 kilometers wide between Rinnokusovka, broke the front line and cut off the 62nd Army from the Stalingrad front. But he could not break into the city on the move, much less take it. On the left flank of the UVF, from the south, the 4th Panzer Gotha captured St. Tinguta and rushes to St. Tundutovo, entering the rear of the 64th Army, and in the center the enemy, having crossed the Don, took Kalak and pressed the flank of the 62nd Army, threatening the rear and encirclement of both armies. In response to the enemy's breakthrough, A. Vasilevsky and A. Eremenko make a decision. General K. Kovalenko, Deputy V. Gordov, immediately, on the night of August 24, with a group of 3 divisions, a tank brigade and the 28th Tank Corps, strike from Panchino and Kotlubin on Malrososhka, and at the same time Commander Lopatin from the side of the 62nd Army, hit the 87th Division at the same point, cut the corridor, restore the defense along the Don. The group of General A. Shtevnev, 2nd and 23rd Tank Corps, strike from the market and Orlovka to Yazovka at dawn, cut off the enemy from the Volga. Scheme 8. On the morning of August 24, a telegram from Stalin was received: fight the enemy day and night, attack the united aviation of the fronts, all artillery and AS. Stalingrad is to be held at all costs. And in the afternoon, Stalin and Vasilevsky decided to urgently strengthen the Stalingrad front with 3 armies, and the city with several divisions and units. However, it took time to advance them to positions. It became a decisive factor in disrupting the plans of the enemy. Before the reserves arrive, A. Eremenko orders all available forces to attack the Germans along the entire breakthrough line, cut off the corridor and restore the defense along the outer contour. All these decisions were carried out in the period from the 23rd of August to the 3rd of September. Attempts by the Soviet troops to liquidate, and the German troops to expand the corridor turned into unusually bloody battles with heavy losses for both. On the night of August 24, Kovalenko's group intercepted the corridor, but the Germans tore apart a thin partition. Subsequent attempts also failed, in particular on August 26, although the group was reinforced by 2 divisions and tank units. The Germans each time restored the situation. The front here stabilized at the Panchino-Tomilin line. The Germans, realizing the importance of this corridor, hastily fortified positions on its walls, and under our blows they put forward barriers, sometimes not even having time to cover them with artillery fire and armor, and dooming them to death, but at all costs maintaining access to the Volga. In accordance with the decision of the headquarters, the 21st and 63rd Armies of the Stalingrad front delivered converging blows from the Yelanskaya and Serafimovichi, and captured a bridgehead measuring 50 by 25 kilometers on the right bank of the Don. At the same time, Moskalenko's 1st Guards Army crushed parts of the Germans with attacks on Peskovatka and advanced 10 to 15 kilometers, Scheme 8. However, they could not cut the corridor. On the same days, Shtevnev's group, August 28, propelled an attempt by General Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps to break out of the corridor to the northern outskirts of the city. Neither side achieved its goals. The Soviet command in a critical situation did not have sufficient forces and means, especially tanks and aircraft, to eliminate the breakthrough. Soviet 37mm anti-aircraft guns are camouflaged in coastal bushes on the banks of the Don. With the dominance of German aviation, a vital precaution. Stalingrad Front. August 1942. Hastily created shock groups were formed from weakened formations, Reserves approached in parts and on the move, without preparation, rushed into battle. But the German command was also unable to fulfill the main task, to immediately deploy Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps to capture Stalingrad from the north. Wietersheim, attacked from all sides and cut off more than once, himself found himself in such a desperate situation that he requested permission to withdraw. But, according to F. Halder, von Weichs forbade the retreat, referring to Hitler's categorical order. Ultimately, the operational result, the failure of the capture of the city and the gain in time for defense, turned out to be in favor of the Soviet command. The German 4th Air Fleet did not stop bombing Stalingrad. The living conditions in it for the population became impossible, and already on the night of August 23, A.S. Chuyanov, through Yeremenko, asked Stalin for permission to evacuate via direct communication via HF with headquarters, but Stalin, apparently not yet having full information about the situation, answered to the request denied. According to Yeremenko, it sounded something like this: "It should be understood that if the evacuation and mining of factories begins, then these actions will be understood as a decision to surrender Stalingrad. Therefore, the GKO prohibits preparations for the explosion of enterprises and their evacuation." The decision to evacuate the population was 2 days late and was made only on August 25. It was carried out under enemy fire and bombardment by the Volga Rivermen and the Volga Military Flotilla, Rear Admiral D. Rogashev. A threatening situation developed both on the southern front and in the center of the SEF. 11 German divisions, 8 infantry, 2 tank and 1 motorized, advanced against the 62nd and right flank of the 64th armies. Goff's exit to Tundutovo intercepted the rear of the 62nd, and the German breakthrough along the Kalak-Stalingrad railway opened up the rear of both Soviet armies and a direct shortcut to Stalingrad. In this situation, army commanders Lopatin and Shumilov undertook a skillful operational maneuver. On the night of August 31, while the 64th Army held back the enemy at Rakitino in battle, the main forces of the 62nd made a difficult 40 km march, withdrew to the middle contour and occupied the Rinnokusovka November line. Rogatchik. Shoulder to her, having made the same way out from under the blow, the 64th Army from November. Rogatchik to the river. Scarlet. It was not possible to surround the Soviet armies. The Germans, having missed this moment, urgently created a grouping of 6 infantry, 2 tank and 1 motorized divisions, and, following Hitler's categorical order to break into the city by September 1, they tried again to break through the front of the 62nd and 64th armies. The fighting lasted 3 days, took place with great damage to both sides, and gave the Germans only a partial success, a small wedged into the junction of the armies at Basargino. But behind the back of the Soviet armies there was not a single battalion of reserves, and the front command did not have them either. Therefore, in order to avoid new coverage and encirclement, on September 2, by order of A. Yeremenko, the 62nd and 64th armies retreated to the inner contour. Passed with great damage to both sides and gave the Germans only a partial success, a small wedged into the junction of the armies at Basargino. But behind the back of the Soviet armies there was not a single battalion of reserves, and the front command did not have them either. Therefore, in order to avoid new coverage and encirclement, on September 2, by order of A. Yeremenko, the 62nd and 64th armies retreated to the inner contour. Passed with great damage to both sides and gave the Germans only a partial success, a small wedged into the junction of the armies at Basargino. But behind the back of the Soviet armies there was not a single battalion of reserves, and the front command did not have them either. Therefore, in order to avoid new coverage and encirclement, on September 2, by order of A. Yeremenko, the 62nd and 64th armies retreated to the inner contour. From September 3 to September 12, battles unfolded on the near approaches to Stalingrad, and from September 13, the assault on the city itself began. German scouts who went to the Volga on an armored car SD KFZ 232 inspect the opposite, eastern, bank of the river. August-September 1942. Assault on Stalingrad. The period from 3 to the 13th of September proved to be a turning point for the high commands of both sides. In those days, decisions were made that predetermined both the outcome of the strategic defense of Stalingrad and the radical turning point in the course of the entire war. By the beginning of September, the German command was in a difficult position. They failed to encircle and destroy the Russian armies on the outskirts of Stalingrad and take the city. Plotting a breakthrough, The Germans hoped with a shocking airstrike, the destruction of the city and the population, to break the will of the defenders, but days passed and it became clear that the Russians were determined to fight not only on the outskirts, but also in the city itself. This was stated in the appeal of the City Party Committee: "We will cover all the streets with barricades. Let us make every house an impregnable fortress." Now there was only one thing left: a frontal assault on the stone quarters, spread over tens of kilometers. And although the destructiveness of street fighting loomed quite clearly before the German command, it could not do anything else. Once again, the Russians were forced to make a very undesirable decision. It also became obvious to the German leadership that the Soviet strategic defense in the auxiliary direction had turned the entire campaign plan upside down. Stalingrad has become a decisive point for the actions of the main forces, and the outcome of the battles of the whole year will be decided near this city. In the future, a Russian winter loomed frighteningly, with unpredictable consequences. Hitler hurried the generals Wykes, Paulus and Hoff hard. The day before the new assault, on September 12, 1942, at headquarters near Vinnytsia, he categorically demanded, "Concentrate all available forces and take Stalingrad as quickly as possible and take possession of the entire bank of the Volga." At the same time, under Stalingrad, Hitler additionally allocated several more divisions, German infantrymen on one of the outskirts of Stalingrad. September 1942. On the same days, the Soviet High Command also made the final conclusion: the center of hostilities had shifted to the south, and the further course of the struggle on the entire Soviet-German front would be decided on its southern wing, near the Volga. Therefore, the main goal of the defense is to resist and defeat the German armies right here, in Stalingrad. In the meantime, the forces of the Stalingrad front, primarily the 1st Guards armies of Moskalenko, 66th, Malinovsky, 24th, Kozlov, it was supposed to strike from the north and close the gap between the fronts. Stalin recalled G.K. Zhukov from the Western Front to send him to Stalingrad to organize this strike. Late in the evening of August 28, Zhukov entered Stalin's office. Zhukov knew that the situation in the south was difficult, but what he heard shocked him. It may happen that the Germans will take Stalingrad, and this was not said by anyone, but by Stalin himself. At one glance at the map, it became clear: the surrender of Stalingrad is a disaster. And this could not, should not have happened. Such an outcome did not fit in the mind. On August 29, Zhukov flew to Stalingrad. On September 3, Zhukov received a telegram from Stalin: "The situation in Stalingrad is deteriorating. The enemy is 3 miles away. Stalingrad can be taken today or tomorrow if the northern group does not provide immediate assistance. Demand, immediately hit the enemy and come to the aid of the Stalingraders. No delay is allowed. Procrastination is now tantamount to a crime. Throw all aviation to the aid of Stalingrad." Zhukov still kept the deadlines for concentrating troops and, in order to avoid unnecessary losses, threw at least somehow equipped units into battle. From 3 to the 12th of September, the attacks of the armies of the Stalingrad front on the left flank of Paulus pulled his tanks and motorized infantry from the assault on the city. The strikes were carried out in difficult conditions: slow delivery and concentration of troops, lack of funds, fuel, ammunition and time to put together formations. In addition, the area, open as a tablecloth, was deadly unfavorable for an offensive under the complete dominance of German aviation. Everything was further complicated by the Soviet commanders' lack of experience in the massive use of tanks, the outdated formation of combat formations of units in 3 lines, which made it difficult for them to fire to kill at the beginning of attacks, while they themselves were subjected to enemy fire. This caused in October the order of the headquarters in the route change field tactics. The advance of the Soviet troops for 2 to 3 kilometers met with a strong fire resistance from the Germans and did not solve the main problem. In the course of these battles, Zhukov and Vasilevsky became more and more convinced that the situation at Stalingrad could not be reversed with available forces and army strikes. The calculation of the German heavy machine gun Milligram 34 is preparing for battle on the outskirts of Stalingrad. September 1942. On September 12, Stalin met Zhukov and Vasilevsky summoned to headquarters with the question: what does the Stalingrad front need in order to eliminate the corridor and connect with the southeastern? Zhukov reported on the situation and in particular said, "We need at least a full-blooded army, tank formations and artillery." Stalin bent over the map of the reserves, and Zhukov, walking with Vasilevsky to the window, said in an undertone, "Still, this is not a solution. Yes, agreed Vasilevsky, that's a half measure. We need to look for another solution. Stalin heard and instantly jumped up from the map. What is the other solution? Both commanders returned to the table and briefly explained the essence of the other solution. It was during this discussion that at some point the idea flashed like lightning, to surround the entire German group near Stalingrad with powerful blows. And the very next day, September 13th at 22 o'clock, the plan was reported in general terms to Stalin. From that day on, the defenders of Stalingrad had a heavy fate at the cost of great blood and sacrifices to resist until the day and hour of X. And they, not knowing about this decision, survived. By coincidence, two opposing ideas or two decisive plans arose on the same days. The German one, to take Stalingrad and push the Russians back to Astrakhan, and the Soviet one, to hold Stalingrad and encircle the Germans between the Volga and the Don. The Germans appointed the assault on the city on September 13th, about which at night, at the time of the discussion of the plan, Eremenko reported to Stalin. He immediately ordered Zhukov to fly to the Stalingrad front and Vasilevsky to the southeast. The defense of the city took place at a distance of 2 to 10 kilometers and was assigned to the 62nd Army from the market to Kuparosnaya, 50 kilometers, and the 64th from Kuparosnaya to Ivanovka, 25 kilometers. The 62nd Army, which bore the brunt of the defense, fought unsuccessful battles on the inner contour, where the Germans suffered heavy losses in 10 days. But by the time the formations of the 62nd withdrew directly to the city bypass, the army numbered 40,000 people against 100,000 among the Germans, 723 guns against 1435 German, and 60 tanks against 500. Paulus and Goth finally closed the empty ring, but not on the banks of the Volga and not in the city, but in front of it, to the west, and they were again opposed by the 62nd and 64th armies, which were not surrounded. Stalingrad, as an object of defense assault, represented a narrow, from 2 to 5 kilometers, strip 60 kilometers long from the river. Dry Machetka to Krasnoarmeysk, and according to the existing structure was divided into 3 parts, the northern one, to the Krasny Oktябrь plant, the central one, from Krasny Oktябrь to Kuparosny, and the southern one, from Kuparosny, including the Krasnoarmeysky district. Layout: narrow rectangles of quarters with long straight longitudinal and short transverse streets. This made it easier for the defenders to set up barricades and organize fire, but it also allowed the enemy to fire through, making it difficult for the defenders to maneuver. In the west, there were small heights in front of the city, and many ravines, beams, crashed directly into the city, which gave the enemy advantages in observation and covert accumulation of troops. The width of the Volga in the region of Stalingrad is 1 to 2 kilometers, steamboat crossings, ferries and boats. The main one is near Krasnaya Polyana. The right bank of the Volga, steep and high, created large, dead spaces, inaccessible to enemy artillery. Headquarters and rear were located there. The terrain as a whole is not favorable for defense, the readiness of which by September 10 did not exceed 25%. Delivery of ammunition on tractors STZ, 5 Noti. Stalingrad Front, Autumn 1942. The strength and stubbornness of the defense was created by the courage and moral stamina of the troops, the power of fire, the maneuver of forces and means. It was by no means frontal, positional, but was characterized by exceptional maneuverability, and more so on our part, because the German, having tied up the main forces by storm, limited its freedom of maneuver on the flanks. After unsuccessful attempts to capture Stalingrad from the north by turning the 14th Panzer Corps south along the Volga, Paulus decided to capture the city center with a frontal attack from the west. On September 13 at 8 a.m., after an hour of powerful air and artillery preparation, the Germans delivered 2 blows, with the forces of 2 infantry divisions from Gorodishkai in the direction of Mamov-Kurgan, height 102.0, and with 2 tank, 1 motorized and infantry divisions from Sadovoy and Zelenaya Polyana on suburbs of Minin and Kuparosnoy, Scheme 9. The idea was based on access to the Volga, primarily at Mamov-Kurgan, which occupied a key position in the city plan. Kurgan, as a dominant height, divided the center and the whole of Stalingrad exactly in half and opened command control over both halves of the city, over the Volga, crossings and the left bank. With the capture of Mamov-Kurgan, the torn 62nd Army and both halves of the city immediately closed in 2 rings. From the north, from the already punched corridor, from the south, from Kuparosny. On the first day of the assault on September 13, the 35th Division and the 10th Brigade repulsed the German attacks on the suburbs of Minin and Kuparosnoye, while in the direction of Mamav-Kurgan, the Germans managed to capture the MTS village and the Aerodromny village in the 23rd Panzer Corps zone. The losses on both sides were considerable. The Germans lost up to 1,300 people and about 40 tanks. In our 6th Tank Brigade, which fell at the point of impact, 1 out of 15 combat-ready tanks remained, and 30 people from the crews. On the night of August 14, Acting Commander 62N Krylov, appointed by V. Chuikov, arrived on September 14, organized a counterattack unexpected for the enemy, and the Germans, who themselves prepared for the attack, were forced to repulse it with tanks and aircraft. Scheme 9. Fighting in the central part of Stalingrad on September 13, 1942. September 14 was a critical day. Paulus attacked 7 divisions, 500 tanks, aircraft, brought down the fire of thousands of guns. The fighting unfolded at Mamav-Kurgan, along the Tsaritsa River, at an elevator on the outskirts of the suburb of Minin. The Germans resorted to tricks. They marked false attacks, repainted their tanks in the color of the Soviet ones, painted stars on them. By the end of the day, the Germans had captured the Mamav-Kurgan, went to the Stalingrad 1 station, and took the central crossing under automatic fire. It seemed that one more pressure and the city would be taken. In this situation, when the fate of Stalingrad hung on the hour and minute hands, Yeremenko decided, immediately, during the day, under continuous enemy fire, to transport Rodimtsev's 13th Division across the Volga. The crossing was covered only by officers of the army headquarters and commandant platoons. There were no other powers. Division Katyusha crushed the German submachine gunners with their volley, and Soviet companies and battalions attacked directly from ferries and boats. The Germans rolled back from the shore. Mamav-Kurgan is the key to the entire defense, and it was necessary to recapture it from the Germans at all costs. V. Chuikov at dawn on September 16, after a 10-minute artillery preparation, throws 2 regiments into the assault. The attack took place in a deployed formation. The Germans literally mowed down our fighters with ground fire of all means and bombardment. The battalion of Captain Kirin was the first to break into the mound from the gentle side, along the steep slope to the top, the platoon of Lieutenant Vdovichenko, who was immediately killed in hand-to-hand combat. He was replaced by Sergeant Kutsenko, and 6, out of 30, remaining fighters held the crest. Mamav-Kurgan was recaptured. The German attacks made in the following days only increased the number of their losses. From September 15 to 19, exceptionally fierce fighting was in full swing in the center of the southern part. On the squares, on the streets and lanes, in houses, in basements, and on floors, in ditches and ravines. Attacks and counterattacks lost count. These days, the words of Sergeant Y.A. F. Zaitsev sounded throughout the country: "We will not surrender Stalingrad. There is no land for us beyond the Volga." They became a symbol of the resilience of the defenders of Stalingrad and their slogan. Soviet soldiers took up defense in the ruins of a house on the outskirts of Stalingrad. September 1942. On September 17, the battles for the Stalingrad 1 station reached a special stubbornness. It was stormed under air cover by a German battalion with 20 tanks, and it changed hands 4 times. But by evening, 10 German tanks were burned, and the remnants of the attackers were driven back. The company commander, Lieutenant Koleganov, informed the battalion commander of Art. To Lieutenant Fedoseev, "As long as I, the commander, not a single bastard will pass alive. Personally, I myself am hearing death, I fall from my feet, but we will perish, and we will not retreat." In the southern part, the Germans still managed to occupy the suburbs of Minin and Kuparosnoye. With the enemy entering this sector, the 62nd Army was cut off not only from the north, but also from the south, and pressed close to the Volga. The Germans launched attacks on Nizhnyaya Elshanka, threatening to strike at the Transvolga region, the rear of the front and the base of the Volga flotilla. The fighting lasted 4 days. A large role in strengthening the stability of the defense was played, by the definition of a Yeremenko, by the frontline artillery fist, under the centralized leadership of the front command. The fist was controlled by General V. Dmitriev. The created artillery groups, sometimes up to 200 guns and mortars per 1 kilometer of the front, promptly, within 15 to 20 minutes, launched a fire strike at any point in the city against the enemy prepared for the attack. They could put barrage fire while coordinating actions with aviation. Scheme 10. Fights in the central and southern parts of Stalingrad from September 14 to September 19, 1942. On September 18, the situation became more complicated and the Stavka ordered the Stalingrad front to strike again at Gorodish, Gumrak and link up with the 62nd Army. She, reinforced by the 92nd Rifle and 137th Tank Brigades, was supposed to tie the Germans in the city at the same time with a counterattack from Mamavkurgan on Gorodish. The strikes brought little success, but Paulus had the forces of the entire northern group pinned down and he could not strengthen the assault on the city center at a critical moment, and only on September 21 to 22, reinforced with reserves, made a new attempt to capture the center and Mamavkurgan. In the Chronicle, the battles of September 21 to 22 stand out in particular. On September 21, after a long artillery and aviation preparation, 5 enemy divisions simultaneously rushed into the attack: 76th and 94th Infantry, 24th and 14th Tank, 29th Motorized. The main blow fell on the divisions of Rodimtsev and Gorishny, 13th and 95th. To help them, Eremenko concentrated the fire of the frontline artillery group against the attacking German units, and sent all the fighters of the 8th Air Army to fight the bombers. All German attacks were repulsed, and submachine gunners, up to 2 companies, that leaked to the central crossing were suppressed by fire from the 42nd and 92nd Brigade. On September 22, the fighting flared up with even greater force. The 76th German Division, with the support of 100 tanks, sought to break the front of the 13th Division. By 12 o'clock, Soviet soldiers repulsed 12 attacks, but by 4 p.m., about 200 German submachine gunners with 15 tanks were able to penetrate the ravine section, on the flank of the 34th Regiment, and at the same time another attacking group engulfed its left flank. Rodimtsev, with his reserve of 2 battalions and a reconnaissance company, knocked out both enemy groups. But in other areas the situation was more dangerous. The Germans reached the buildings of the specialists' house. One of their regiments advanced along the ravine along the river. The Queen, the other with tanks, a little to the south, cutting off the 42nd and 92nd Brigade from the 13th Division. For 5 days the Soviet fighters fought in the encirclement, and on September 27 they left their areas. South of the River Queens, in the area of the elevators, there were merciless battles for destruction. The diary of a German officer says about them: the 16th of September 1942, 30 to 40 people remained in the companies. It is not people who fight in the elevator, but devils, neither a bullet nor fire takes them. The 22nd of September 1942, only 40 dead Russians were found in the elevator, sea devils. And only one seriously wounded, no longer able to speak. This was the platoon commander Andrei Kotsianov. V. I. Chuikov cites his story about the battle in his memoirs. On the same day, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 13th Division fought near the Stalingrad 1 railway station. The Germans surrounded the 1st Battalion and the 5th Company of the 2nd. By evening, the company escaped, and the entire 1st Battalion, fighting to the end, died. Only one nurse retreated to her own, who carried the last still alive, but mortally wounded soldier out of the battle. By evening, the company escaped, and the entire 1st Battalion, fighting to the end, died. Only one nurse retreated to her own, who carried the last still alive, but mortally wounded soldier out of the battle. By evening, the company escaped, and the entire 1st Battalion, fighting to the end, died. Only one nurse retreated to her own, who carried the last still alive, but mortally wounded soldier out of the battle. German command post near the famous elevator, which was the key to the defense of the southern part of the city and became a symbol of the steadfastness of the defenders of Stalingrad. September 1942. As a result, in 14 days of fighting, advancing with huge losses of 100 meters a day, the Germans occupied part of the southern half and the center of the city, but did not break the resistance of the 62nd Army and did not achieve a turning point in their favor. This caused extreme concern at Hitler's headquarters. The failure of the capture of Stalingrad and, in connection with this, the failure of the 1942 campaign plan became obvious. Stalingrad was supposed to seem to the Germans as a bloodthirsty and sinister Moloch. For 100 meters of moving along the streets, he swallowed the incomparable forces and means of the Wehrmacht, strengthening the premonition of impending disaster in the highest German headquarters. Hitler tried to find the culprits. Heads flew. The commanders of the 14th and 4th Panzer Corps, Wietersheim and Schwedler, were the first to be removed. Their criticism of the decisions of the command was considered defeatist. On September 24, F. Halder was removed from office, who was replaced by K. Zeitzler. The head of the OKH, Colonel General Jodl, was also scheduled to be removed. In his place, Hitler read Paulus, believing to transfer the 6th Army to General Seidlitz, Corps Commander of the 6th Army. But the last move for known reasons did not happen. Having not achieved a decisive turning point in the center of the southern part, Paulus suffered the main blow to the north, and from September 27 to October 8, battles unfolded for the workers' settlements of factories, as well as on the Oriel Ledge, 5x10 km, front length 24 km, where 4 German divisions were located with 120 tanks attached to them, see Diagram 10. Paulus's plan was simple, to seize the factories, and above all the tractor plant, to go here to the Volga and finally move the troops from the corridor to capture the northern part. The implementation of the plan would make it possible to split the entire defense of Stalingrad into isolated sections. A simultaneous attack by the divisions, 24th Panzer, 295th and 100th Infantry, concentrated to the south of Gorodish and Mamav-Kurgan, with the support of 100 tanks, was scheduled for 8 o'clock in the morning. Scheme 11. Scheme 11. Counterattack of the 62nd Army from the Mamav-Kurgan area on September 27, 1942. But the command of the 62nd Army, having guessed the enemy's plan, preempted him at 6 o'clock with a counterattack by 2 tank brigades and 2 rifle divisions. The Soviet troops advanced 2 to 2.5 kilometers, but met with strong opposition from German aviation and artillery, retreated to their original positions. Paulus had to reconduct air and artillery preparation, and only at 12 o'clock began an attack on the village of Krasny Artyuba and Mamav-Kurgan. The Germans, having superiority in tanks and aircraft, broke into the village, but breaking in does not mean taking. Fierce fighting continued for 7 days, day and night. In city blocks, or rather in their ruins, close fights began, often reaching hand-to-hand fights, for every street, house, floor. As a result, the Germans advanced 300 to 400 meters and suffered such losses that until October 5 they abandoned their attacks, moving the onslaught to the north. The attack on the village of Barakada on the first day of September 27 cost the Germans an infantry regiment and 30 tanks. On September 28, they managed to make some progress, but the 308th Siberian Division of Gurtiev, transferred here, held them back until October 5, giving Chuikov the opportunity to regroup. With special force on September 28, the Germans attacked the Oriel Ledge, Scheme 12. After 7 days of fighting, they broke through our defenses north and south of Orlovka, advanced to the railway, cut the ledge in two and surrounded the Soviet units northwest of Orlovka. The 115th Rifle Brigade and the regiments of the 112th Division of Yermolkin, more precisely, their remnants of 100 to 150 fighters, turned out to be in the ring. The losses of the Germans in this case amounted to 2,500 people and 70 tanks. But the Soviet troops soon broke out of the encirclement. Colonel of the German General Staff G. Dinger testifies to the intensity of these battles. All our attempts to suppress the resistance of the Russians with artillery and dive bombers remained in vain. We sent more and more units into the attack, but they invariably rolled back with terrible losses, so firmly the Russians dug into the ground. In the end, the Russians were surrounded. The command of Army Group B, fulfilling Hitler's demands for the speedy capture of Stalingrad, replenished the 6th Army with reserves. Paulus stepped up the pressure. The situation was approaching a critical moment. The line of defense slowly, by meters a day, moved to the factories. The command of the UVF during the September battles concluded that the measures taken so far, counterattacks in the city and strikes on the Stalingrad front, no longer give a lasting result. The enemy, using his short communications, manages to transfer parts for a parry, and then quickly returns them to storm the city. Therefore, it is necessary to strike at a distance, create a false impression of the plans and divert his forces for a long time. The first such strike on September 25 by the armies of Trufanov, 51st, and Tolbukin, 57th, knocked the enemy out of the Interlake Defile, Scheme 13. 2 Romanian divisions lost 4,000 men, 1 lost their entire artillery. The worried Germans urgently reinforced them with their units from the city. The second strike of the 51st Army was delivered on September 29 and turned out to be even more effective. The Romanian Corps lost 3,000 people. Killed, 17 tanks, 15 guns, dozens of mortars and other means. Soviet troops captured Sadovoy. But most importantly, the appearance of Russian tanks with Katyushas near Sadovoy was considered at Paulus's headquarters as an intention to strike at Kotelnikovo, that is, in the rear of the 6th Army, and immediately transferred 2 tank divisions and artillery divisions here. Thus, these strikes helped the bleeding divisions of V. Chuikov to hold key lines in Stalingrad and win precious days and weeks. The German command sought to bring the assault to an end, and in October the situation on the front of the 62nd Army worsened more and more. At the headquarters of the 62nd Army, from left to right, Chief of Staff N. I. Krylov, Commander V. I. Chuikov, Member of the Armed Forces K. A. Gurov, Division Commander A. I. Rodimtsev. Stalingrad, 1942. Scheme 12. Battles on the Oriel Ledge on September 29 and 30, 1942. Fighting after the loss of the Oriel Ledge moved from the villages to the territory of the Krasny Oktyabr, Barricada and tractor factories. The rest of the territory was shot through with all types of fire. Maneuver became possible only at night or during smoke. The army had 4 crossing directions using the Volga Islands, Boleshek and Aktuba for bases. All of them were under continuous fire, and the troops, equipment and the floating craft themselves suffered losses even on the berths. In early October, on a narrow front of 25 kilometers, the enemy had 12 divisions, 7 infantry, 2 tank, 2 motorized, with 300 tanks against the weakened 62nd Army. In October, the Germans concentrated the main onslaught on the tractor plant, as the center of defense of the entire northern sector. Here they defended themselves from the north. The group of Colonel Gorokov, 124th and 149th Brigades, from the west and south, the 37th and 38th Divisions of Generals V. Geludev and I. Lyudnikov, which were greatly thinned in battles. The Germans in a narrow area, breaking the river Wedmachetka, pulled over 100 tanks and several infantry regiments. For 5 days, having bled themselves with terrible losses, they advanced 300 to 400 m, and after that, 6 days until October 13, they could not advance. Chuikov during this time advanced the 95th Division here. The enemy resumed the offensive only on October 14, throwing a fresh division into the attack with the support of 150 tanks in the zone of the 95th and 37th Soviet divisions. With dense fire, the Germans managed to blow up minefields, break into separate sections of the tractor factory and go opposite it to the Volga. It cost them 1,500 dead and 50 tanks. The front of the 62nd Army was cut here. It already seemed to the German command that one more throw and the Russians would be thrown into the Volga, after which it would be possible to proceed with the main task of the 1942 campaign of the year, the capture of the Caucasus. Scheme 13. Counterattacks of the 57th and 51st Armies on September 25 and 29, 1942. A German non-commissioned officer with a captured Soviet Pipisha machine gun hid behind a pile of factory garbage in the Stalingrad ruins. September, October 1942. The brewing critical moment caused alarm in the Soviet headquarters. As early as October 5, Eremenko received telegram number 170634, "I demand that you take all measures to defend Stalingrad. Stalingrad must not be surrendered, but that part of Stalingrad which is occupied by the enemy must be liberated." Stalin. In October, the headquarters made the final decision on a powerful counter-offensive, so Stalingrad had to be held at all costs. From October 30, the Southwestern, N.F. Vatutin, and Don, K.K. Rokossovsky, fronts were formed on the basis of the Stalingrad front, and the Southeastern became the Stalingrad, A.I. Eremenko. Since the transfer of reinforcements across the Volga became extremely difficult for the 62nd Army, in order to help it resist on October 19, by decision of the headquarters, the Don Front went on the offensive against Orlovka with the forces of 4 divisions and 4 tank brigades. And the 64th Army of the Stalingrad Front struck from the south on the flank of the 6th Army from the Kuparosnoye-Zelenaya Rama area. Fights with little advance, but with great damage to the Germans, went on until November 1 and forced Paulus to withdraw from the assault on the city. A significant part of the tanks, artillery and aircraft to parry the blows. G.K. Zhukov noted in his memoirs, "If it had not been for help from the Don Front and the 64th Army, the 62nd Army would not have been able to resist and Stalingrad might have been taken." The October battles, which played a large role in the defense of Stalingrad, cost its defenders huge casualties and blood. There were 200 to 400 people left in the divisions, but the German troops were also so exhausted that Paulus, after the fighting at the tractor factory, was no longer able to organize a single such strong blow. Despite the fact that by mid-October Hitler had transferred significant reinforcements to Stalingrad, dozens of sapper battalions, 60 artillery divisions, and marching battalions. Wounded, torn apart along the front, the 62nd Army over the past month has held the defense in three pockets: in the north, where the group of Colonel Gorokov fought; in the center, where units of the 138th Division steadfastly held out on a small piece of land near the Barricade plant; and further, after a small gap, the main front of the 62nd Army went south, to Mamav-Kurgan and to the junction with the 64th Army. By mid-November, the troops pressed against the Volga in the northern sector were fighting under particularly difficult conditions. But it was quite clear that the enemy was stopped and powerless to achieve any new successes. In the south, from the center to the Krasnoarmysky district, the 64th Army on a front of 40 kilometers firmly held its positions on the outer contour, not allowing the Germans even to the outskirts of the city. A German tank took refuge in the Stalingrad gully. The silhouette of an elevator is visible on the horizon. The calculation of the divisional 76mm cannon ZISZ is firing at the enemy in Stalingrad. Autumn 1942. From the end of October and into November, the Germans constantly made attempts to throw the Russians off the remaining islands, but they all turned into protracted and terrible street battles for the ruins of houses, factories, and ruined buildings. The remnants of the regiments and divisions of the 62nd Army, dying, did not surrender the last lines of defense. In the area of /U-200B/U-200 Barricades plant, Gurtiev's 308th Division repelled 100 attacks in just 3 weeks. Lyudnikov's 138th Division, cut off on November 11th and pressed to the shore on a patch of 400 by 700 m, almost without ammunition and food, did not retreat not one step. The Germans made especially fierce attempts to take over the factories on November 11th to 13th, but the result was thousands of dead in front of the positions of both divisions. The enemy one day managed to capture part of the workshops of the Krasny-Artyuba plant, but the 45th Division of V. Sokolova, with fire support from the frontline artillery group, knocked him out and held positions until November 19th. Paulus never managed to take over the factory part of the city center. The northern group of S. Gorokov, 6,500 fighters, kept the defense surrounded along the Rinnokusovka settlement line. Spartacist. Thrown against her in November, 2 reinforced divisions, each supported by 50 tanks, could not cut or push her. The frontline artillery group, like a hammer, beat the attackers. Having changed tactics and abandoned massive attacks with huge losses, the enemy, taking into account the experience of the Russians, began to operate in small groups, but did not achieve success. The attacks already bore the stamp of desperation. In the diary of the German commander of the battalion of the 271st Regiment of the 305th Infantry Division, F. Gizzi, there is an entry dated November 11, 1942. After 2 attacks, 9 non-commissioned officers and 17 soldiers remained in the battalion. Paulus's last offensive, undertaken from November 11 to 13, was initially hopeless, like the last winter offensive of Army Group Center in 1941 near Moscow. After 48 hours it was reduced to fierce hand-to-hand combat defying centralized leadership, and although small groups of the enemy managed to overcome these last, damned, 300 meters to the Volga, but the Germans were immediately surrounded, as the Russians cut the narrow corridors. For another 4 days, fierce battles continued, in which no prisoners were taken, and there was no hope of survival. Despite the extremely difficult situation of the 62nd Army in October-November 1942, the initiative irrevocably passed into the hands of the defending Soviet troops. And when, at dawn on November 19, the roar of cannonade of 2,000 Soviet guns swept over the smoking ruins of Stalingrad from the north, many German soldiers and officers, anxiously listening to these thunderous peals, realized that the course of the Battle of Stalingrad and the course of the entire war began to inevitably turn into another, opposite side. A German heavy half-track tractor with an 88mm anti-aircraft gun mounted on it is captured by Soviet troops. Summer 1942. Conclusion. The battles in the North Caucasus and near Stalingrad ended the first period of the Great Patriotic War. The battle for Stalingrad continued for more than 3 months and Hitler was forced to give Order No. 1 on the transition of the Eastern Front to the defense. The order prescribed, by all means, hold the achieved lines, repel all attempts by the enemy to break through them and thereby create the prerequisites for our offensive in 1943. This was an admission of the failure of the entire 1942 campaign. It should be noted that it would be a clear simplification to assert that the 1942 campaign plan adopted by the Hitlerite leadership collapsed due to initial fallacy or adventurism. On the contrary, these plans were calculated in the German headquarters, where they were by no means simpletons, but qualified specialists who knew their job. The fatal miscalculation of the German strategists was not in the development of obviously unrealistic plans, but in a self-confident overestimation of the forces and means of their army and in underestimating the forces and capabilities of their enemy. The moral stamina of the Russian soldier, the fighters and commanders of the Red Army, the operational skill of its commanders were underestimated by the German generals. Economic opportunities of the Soviet Union. The headquarters of the Supreme High Command and Stalin did not expect such a powerful German offensive in 1942 on the entire southern wing and did not have a pre-prepared defense plan. All measures to repulse were worked out in the course of operations on the fronts, and under the pressure of a critical, harsh situation, sometimes equally harsh decisions were made, such as, for example, Order No. 227 in July 1942, landing sailors of the Volga military flotilla. Stalingrad, October 1942. The country found itself at the extreme boundary. Not just huge, 1 million square kilometer territories were lost, but industrial areas. This is more than 20 million able-bodied population, about 800 million poods of grain per year, more than 10 million tons of metal per year, etc. During this period, the soldiers and commanders of the Red Army had to correct the mistakes and miscalculations of the command with courage and blood. By stubborn defense, they held back the onslaught of the German groups and won the time necessary to accumulate reserves. At Stalingrad, the German generals were forced into a general battle which they did not expect here, but were forced to accept, realizing its decisive significance. By November 19, the command of Army Group B was in a difficult position. The exhausted armies became extremely small in number, they lost their divisional and corps reserves. There were no more large forces in the rear, and Stalingrad, which had swallowed them up, was never taken. On the stretched flanks of the Stalingrad grouping of the Germans were the Allied Italian, Hungarian and Romanian troops, who were not distinguished by high combat capability. A harsh Russian winter was coming. But the sharp drop in the morale of the troops was even more alarming for the German command. Numerous documents and memoirs testify that in November the mood of not only soldiers, but also officers of the Wehrmacht near Stalingrad was depressed, faith in victory disappeared, and its place was taken by the only hope to get out of this pitch hell alive. The German officer W. Hoffmann, already mentioned by us, who rejoiced on August 23 about the terrible bombardment of Stalingrad, involuntarily reflected in his diary a consistent change in his moods that occurred from September to October. Entry on September 1, 1942. Do the Russians really intend to fight on the very bank of the Volga? This is insane. September the 11th and 16th, barbarism, fanatics, October 25th. Darkness and fog awaits us all. October 27th, Russians are not people, but some kind of iron creatures. They never get tired and are not afraid of fire. Orff considers himself doomed here. Here are other testimonials. From the diary of Lieutenant of the 578th Infantry Regiment G. Honnes, no one will convince me that my comrades die with the words, Heil Hitler, or, Germany. Their last words of help or curses. Or the entry on the last page of the diary of the division commander of the 8th Air Corps, Count von Eisedel, the grandson of the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. My great-grandfather was right 1,000 times when he said that Germany should never get involved in a war with Russia. In contrast, by mid-November the Soviet forces were not only determined to fight and win, but were in operationally advantageous positions, providing a starting point for a counter-offensive. South of Stalingrad, they firmly held the key area of Bekitovka-Krasnoarmeysk and the line along the line of Lake Sarpat-Satsabar-Mansak, from where on November 19 to 20 the Stalingrad front struck towards the Southwestern and Don fronts. Soviet soldiers inspecting a destroyed German tank PZ-3J, summer 1942. A characteristic feature of the fighting during the defensive period of the battle was their mixed character. Maneuverable operations in open areas alternated with fierce battles directly in the city. If outside the city and on its outskirts the Germans could benefit from their superiority in tanks and aircraft, then as they moved into areas of mangled ruins, brick and concrete, it was lost. When 2 to 3 German tanks with a company of infantry burst into the streets, the Russians easily cut off the infantry. After that, the tanks, going deeper, ran into anti-tank batteries, armor pieces, or were set on fire by grenades or bottles of KS thrown from above. Street fighting demanded great endurance, steadfastness, and self-sacrifice from the soldiers. Opponents converged at extremely close distances, face to face. The murderous nature of such battles is evidenced by a German lieutenant from the 24th Panzer Division. We are fighting for 15 days for one house, using mortars, grenades, machine guns and bayonets. Already on the third day, the corpses of 54 killed Germans were lying in the cellars and on the stairs. Front line runs along the corridor separating the burnt rooms, along the ceiling between the two floors. Reinforcements are brought in from nearby houses via fire escapes and chimneys. From morning to night, continuous battle in the roar of grenade explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, among heaps of cement, pools of blood, fragments of furniture and parts of human bodies. And imagine Stalingrad. 80 days and 80 nights of hand-to-hand fighting. The length of the street is now measured not by meters, but by corpses. Slowly, suffering huge losses, the Germans gnawed their way through the city, through the territory of the factories. During defensive battles, Soviet fighters and commanders showed great skill and resourcefulness in developing new tactics. Despite the numerical superiority of the enemy, they outnumbered him in the tactics of fighting for every street, for every house. The Stalingraders developed a tactic of creating death zones in the city, densely mined houses, streets and squares, to which they themselves knew all the accesses, and the Germans opened killer corridors for the offensive. The tactics of assault groups, small detachments armed with light and heavy machine guns, anti-tank rifles, found great use in Stalingrad. The groups supported each other with swift counterattacks. The very instructions for their actions are drawn up in the combat and offensive Suvorov style. Burst into the house together, you and a grenade, both be dressed lightly, you are without a duffel bag, a grenade, without a shirt, break in like this, a grenade is in front, and you are behind it, go through the whole house again with a grenade in front, and you follow. But when the fighter burst into the house, then an inexorable rule comes into force, of time to turn around. At every step, danger lies in wait for him, it doesn't matter, in every corner of the room, a grenade, and go. The cue from the machine on the remains of the ceiling, not enough, a grenade, and again forward. Another room, a grenade. Turn, another grenade. But inside the object, the enemy can go on a counterattack. Don't be afraid. You have already taken the initiative, it is in your hands. Act angrier with a grenade, machine gun, knife and shovel. The fighting inside the house is furious. So always be prepared for the unexpected. Do not snooze. With such a tactical technique in September, on the orders of the commander of the 42nd Regiment, Colonel A. Yelin, a platoon of Lieutenant N. Zabolotny and a group of Sergeant Y. Pavlov captured 2 strong points, 2 houses 250 meters from the Volga and held them until November 19, although they were continuously attacked and bombarded with 100 shells a day. Broken German tanks of Czechoslovak production PZ-38, T. Prague. January 1943. The German command in the very first days of the assault was discouraged by such tactics, bewildered by a situation that it had not had to deal with before. And what did it oppose? In accordance with their military doctrine, the Germans only increased the massing of attacks in even larger doses and continued the frontal pressure. But such wasteful tactics turned into a large number of corpses and broken equipment. Confusion gripped both the top military leaders and the soldiers. In tactical terms, one of the decisive values in the defense of the city was control over the crossings across the Volga. The fate of the defenders depended on them. But the Germans, underestimating the significance of this fact, from the very beginning stubbornly strove to break through to the Volga through the strip of the city in several places at once. As a result, when it was possible to wedge into the Russian defenses, they were tightly stuck in the interweaving of firing points and fortified points and themselves found themselves in narrow corridors in the role of defenders. The battalion was enough for 2 to 3 attacks, the division for 3 to 4 days. Paulus, with such an organization of the assault, constantly lacked troops and ammunition. One of his radiograms at the end of September to the command of Army Group B was very categorical: our losses in manpower in the city exceed the reinforcements we receive. If this situation does not change, the battle will take on a protracted character. The assessment turned out to be prophetic. It should be noted the operationally effective use of Soviet artillery in Stalingrad. The United Command of the front centralized most of it, by the time of the fighting on the inner city bypass, the front, and later the army artillery groups under a single control. Part of the heavy artillery regiments were behind the Volga, the observers were in the forward formations of the rifle regiments. Within 15 to 20 minutes, the artillery group could place barrage fire, deliver a fire strike at the moment the enemy was ready to attack when he came out of cover. Fire strikes were combined with simultaneous front-line bombing strikes. Such an organization ensured speed of maneuver with trajectories, and sometimes with wheels, Katyusha, anti-tank divisions, the speed of opening an organized and very powerful fire, accurate shooting at targets anywhere in the city. The headquarters summarized the experience of battles and in October, by Order No. 305, made significant changes to the tactics of actions of the created tank corps and artillery divisions, cancelled the obsolete three-echelon formation of a rifle division for the offensive. 20 mm Flak 30 anti-aircraft gun captured by Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad. 1943. The Stalingrad defensive battle was a huge and difficult school for the Soviet troops. The command and staffs gained experience in organizing interaction between infantry, tanks, and aviation. They learned how to conduct a stubborn defense in the city with simultaneous maneuver on the flanks. The command of the Stalingrad and southeastern fronts, despite the superiority of the Germans, carried out counterattacks, inflicting debilitating losses on the enemy. So, in August-September, the German 79th and 305th Infantry Divisions lost almost all their personnel in 3 days of fighting. The 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions were also repeatedly restored anew. Hitler and his generals compared the defense of Stalingrad to the famous Verdun meat grinder during the First World War. But such a comparison suffers from an underestimation of the completely new features and nature of the Stalingrad battles. At Verdun, the defense was purely positional in nature, using mainly gun and machine gun fire, while at Stalingrad it was exceptionally maneuverable and active. And, above all, from the side of the defending Soviet troops, who were in a state of offensive activity and constantly launched counterattacks, the Soviet High Command managed to achieve the main goal, not only to wear down and bleed the enemy, but also to prepare the conditions for a decisive retaliatory strike. Hitler's strategists, according to the original plan, needed Stalingrad as a point ensuring the fulfillment of the main strategic task, the capture of the south of the country and especially the oil regions of the Caucasus. In June-July, after the difficult retreat of the southwestern and southern fronts, the German breakthrough to the Don, the battles near Voronezh and in the Donbass, the capture of Rostov, Hitler and his higher staffs believed in the irresistible strength of the Wehrmacht. They, having decided that the Soviet troops in the south were defeated, hoped to quickly intercept the Volga at Stalingrad, take it on the move, and rush to the Caucasus without delay. German strategic plans were based on the superiority of the Wehrmacht in the main directions. Everything seemed to be calculated and taken into account. But in digital calculations, in the dry wording of directives and orders, the German generals did not take into account two most important factors: the high morale of the Soviet troops and their ability to resist German plans. The Soviet headquarters of the Supreme High Command and the military leaders of all services and branches of the military managed to overcome the critical situation. In a matter of days, literally under fire, a new front was created, a stubborn defense was organized, in which German groups got bogged down in protracted battles, losing strength and time. The Soviet commanders managed to impose their will on the enemy, forced them to change plans and the balance of power. From a secondary point, Stalingrad turned into the main point of strategic defense. The collapse of plans for its rapid capture decided the outcome of the entire 1942 campaign. Captured Field Marshal Paulus, second from right. January 1943. The calculation of the Soviet 122 mm cannon A-19 fires at the enemy. November 1942. Stalingrad was not a pre-prepared fortress, it did not have serious defensive fortifications. All the assaults undertaken by the Germans crashed not on forts and pillboxes, but on the iron steadfastness of Soviet soldiers and commanders. In a burning city, under deadly fire, among dead bodies and destroyed buildings, the defenders of Stalingrad fought with an unyielding determination to die if necessary, but to stand and win, regardless of the victims. Such battles are not amenable to any strategic foresight, they cannot be foreseen by any calculation. They are fought with the utmost tenacity and burning hatred for the enemy. And it was precisely by such battles that the battle for Stalingrad was won, and at the same time the future outcome of the entire war. Illustrations. 8-wheeled armored car SD, KFZ, 232 with a loop antenna from the reconnaissance battalion of the motorized division, Grossdeutschland, Stalingrad direction, summer-autumn 1942. Soviet rocket launchers BM-13 on the chassis of the GAZAA vehicle were successfully used during the defense of Stalingrad in the summer and autumn of 1942. German medium tank PZ-3J from the 24th Panzer Division. Army Group B, Western Bank of the Don, August 1942. Soviet tank T-34 produced by the Stalingrad tractor plant from the 6th Guards Tank Brigade. Southeastern Front, September 1942. German 75mm Stug assault gun. 3 from the 244th Self-Propelled Division of the 6th Army of Paulis. Stalingrad, September 1942. T-34 with a hexagonal turret. Stalingrad Front, November 1942. Medium tank PZ-4F with a long-barreled 75mm gun. In the summer and autumn of 1942, German armored vehicles painted in sand or dirty yellow colors first appeared on the southern sector of the Soviet-German front. Soviet light tanks T-60 were widely used at all stages of the Battle of Stalingrad. The tank is shown in winter camouflage. December 1942. Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. Leave a review about the book, http://Bylinin_Sergey/Stalingradskaya_bitva.html. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Bylinin_Sergey.html.